Chapter 71. Chapter 70. Well, if it isn't little Dio, who always manages to find an excuse not to let me research his powers. Dr. Victoria greeted him as she turned her back to type in the password to close the door. Dr. Victoria October is responsible for all matters related to biology, genetics, and medical science in ARGUS. She claims to be the leading expert on posthuman biology on the planet. She is a woman who appears to be in her 30s, with short black hair and a prominent white streak in the front, much like Rogue from Marvel. Victoria always wears black lipstick and black clothing under her white lab coat and is always seen with her trusty cane to assist with walking due to an old leg injury that has affected her mobility. Pleasure to see you again, Doctor. You've done an excellent job saving so many people. Dio said while looking around. Dr. Victoria October has 2 labs here. One of them is further below where they are, up an entire floor just for her. It's her personal lab, which now has about 10 other scientists who were sitting on the floor looking very down. These scaredy cats were helping me with research when the chaos began. Victoria said as she slowly used her cane to make her way to the other side of the room, where she sat in a chair facing them. Why weren't you infected? Diana asked with curiosity. ARGUS laboratories have independent ventilation systems to ensure there's no chance of infecting the whole building if we were to mess up. Victoria replied. Just like the morgue. Another voice sounded in, one that Dio recognized. John, where are you? Dio asked with joy if his friend was okay. Dr. Johnny Peril is responsible for all matters related to the occult in this place, and he helped him a lot in the beginning by finding material on magic. In the morgue, Johnny replied, and Dio could see that his voice was coming from a landline phone on one of the tables. Whoever attacked us didn't disrupt internal communications, so I called all the floors one by one to find safe people, and after finding Dr. Victoria, we started creating a plan to end this horror movie. Any luck? Diana asked. No, none at all. Dr. Victoria shouted unexpectedly happily about it. She turned her back to them while pressing something on her computer, and the screen displayed an enlarged image of a virus. The virus produces a lot of adrenaline, which makes it hard to think clearly. The infected remain in this state until their hearts literally explode due to the adrenaline. Since its creation, scientists have been desperate to find a cure, and now before achieving that, we have a virus mutation. We'll literally have to throw all our work in the trash and start over. Haha, Victoria explained, and then burst into laughter. It was this personality that initially made Dio hesitate to approach her. There is a lot about her that screams mad genius, and their background in DC makes it sense to be wary of them. However, Dr. Victoria October is a good person, even though she has an unpleasant personality. It took him a while to understand that. This new variant not only makes everyone more chaotic but has also been modified to take down the first ones. Johnny continued the explanation over the phone. What do you mean? Diana asked. The effects of Maru usually start almost immediately after contact with the virus. But now they have their first convulsion, and they don't wake up until a few minutes later with pumped full of adrenaline. Johnny explained. That's how the intruders did it. They would have had to deal with frantic ARGUS soldiers if they had infected everyone in the base at once. The effect would have happened immediately. But by having the infected first experience convulsions, the enemy could quickly move through the entire base while leaving everyone defenseless and grabbing what they wanted. When they left, everything would self-destruct. What was the sequence of events during the attack? Dio asked with curiosity. We have no details about that. We only received the chief signal to seal the base, and then when everyone was inside heading for the bunker, the ventilation was flooded with the virus. They were surprised and unaware that Steve was under control. Whoever did this is long gone, probably with Steve and whatever they came to retrieve. We can't stay here for too long. We have to help the people outside. Diana said while looking at the exit. I'm all ears, Diana. If you happen to know of a cure, you tell me now. Dr. Victoria replied, now gazing through a telescope on her desk. Right here, Diana said while lifting her lasso. Glancing quickly at Diana, Victoria immediately returned to her work and said, yes, unfortunately, we only have one lasso, and there were over 200 people in the building when this chaos started. I think there are about 50 infected survivors after some quick calculations. We don't need a complete cure, just a way to take them all down at once, and then we can use her lasso. Dio suggested. Victoria turned to him once again. That might work, but the problem is finding something that will take them all down at once. Do sedatives not work? Dio asked. The adrenaline in their blood significantly reduces the effects of a common sedative. Victoria explained as she got up and went to a shelf on the side of the room. But we can use this, Victoria said while taking something from the shelf and showing them a small, sealed glass vial. What is this? Diana asked. Nerve gas. Victoria replied casually. Are you out of your mind? Are you crazy? Both John and Dio shouted at the same time. Even though I'm not an expert on scientific matters, I know how dangerous nerve gas is. Relax. This bad boy here was created by me. I haven't even reported to ARGUS about it yet. Victoria replied while playing with the glass vial. Will this help us? Diana asked. It was created to target the motor system first, so those exposed to it are paralyzed and unable to find a cure or a way to save their lives. Victoria explained. How long until it's lethal? Diana asked again. 3 minutes, but since all the infected are pumped up on adrenaline, I'd say the time jumps to 10 minutes. Nobody's going to ask why this lunatic has something so dangerous in her lab. Johnny yelled over the phone. Specifically, on a shelf? Dio added. On a shelf. Johnny yelled. Oh, that's from my personal collection, so don't worry about it. Victoria replied as if it were the most normal thing in the world to have deadly viruses stored on a shelf. This prompted Dio to look at the other glass vials on the shelf. Do you think this will work, Dr. Peril? Diana asked and looked at the phone. John took a few seconds to respond. It makes sense that the high concentration of adrenaline in the body would reduce the effects of nerve gas. I'd say this is our best chance. Johnny said. Do we have antidotes for everyone? Diana asked Victoria with determination. The only reason I haven't released this gas yet is that it's easily cured with a readily available medication. Victoria replied. We can also use the ventilation. Dio suggested and understood that Diana had decided to go with this plan. Here! Victoria shouted and threw the vial at Dio. Dio held the vial as if it were the Holy Grail, and his heart began to race with fear. Just break the vial. Victoria continued. Can both of us be infected? Diana asked. I've already tested it using the data I collected from the demigods. It won't even give you a cold, cursed divine genetics. Victoria replied with anger and showed up in the last part. It seems that analyzing and cloning the DNA of the gods is impossible, so there isn't an army of Diana clones walking around. But we still have the biggest problem. How to gather all the people scattered throughout this place and then cure them using the lasso before distributing the nerve gas antidote. Dio said. I have a plan. Diana said, who was already walking to the laboratory's glass door. Victoria joined them and opened the door for the two of them. I'll gather everyone in the cafeteria, get the antidote, and wait for the right moment. Diana told Victoria. How will we know the signal and when the gas was used? Victoria asked. Internal communications are still functioning. We'll call. Dio said while leaving the door with Diana. As they walked to the next floor, Diana explained her plan. It will be extremely challenging to gather them all in one room because people who have the virus typically attack anyone around them. It's also possible for them to pick targets that are getting too much attention, which is what we'll do. Diana explained. The infected people had no sense of teamwork, so if they gathered them all in one place, they would likely kill each other. However, the situation would change if they made themselves their top priority. What if it doesn't work? This aspect of the virus might have been altered as well. Dio asked. If it doesn't work, we can only pray to the gods and save as many as possible. This was one of the rare occasions when drawing attention to oneself was a good thing, so they needed to do it right. Sikothite. Rise. On the stairs, two skeletons arose from the mist at his side and ran similarly to him. Diana looked at him and said, You're growing faster and faster. I might have to ask for your help when dealing with Cerberus soon. Please don't. Dio replied while imagining a battle against an immortal sorceress known as the Greek goddess of magic. They reached the lower floor. If I remember correctly, this floor was where strategic research against threats was conducted. In front of him, Diana wasted no time and struck her two bracelets together. Blam! The noise was so loud that the windows around them started to shake and looked like they might shatter. Fortunately, Dio had reduced his super hearing when he saw what she was about to do. Otherwise, he would be furious now. Chapter 72. Chapter 71. Boom! It seemed that Diana's idea was beginning to produce results. There are two men appearing from their sides, one in a blood-soaked lab coat and the other in a military uniform armed with a club that also seemed to have been recently used. They suddenly attacked them both at the same time. They didn't wait or act against them. Diana began to run, and Dio followed. Their speed was far faster, but they had to slow down so they wouldn't lose sight of them. Dio was also a bit concerned about their endurance, but they managed to keep up with them. The adrenaline in their bodies was really working overtime. Boom! When they reached the middle of the floor, Diana struck her bracelets to Heather again, and four more people joined the pursuit until they reached the stairs. They went down the stairs by jumping to be faster and entered the next floor. Boom! The moment their pursuers from the floor above exited the stairs, For more new friends arrived, and one of them surprised Dio by appearing right next to him. That's exactly why he summoned his skeletons. One of them grabbed the woman and threw her to the ground, then returned to run alongside him. The woman got up almost immediately and ran while trying to catch them. Boom! 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 They kept adding more guests to their personal zombie horde, which kept growing as they went up each floor. It wasn't an easy task. There were difficulties on every floor. The main difficulty was not stepping on the blood or bodies on the floor. They also had to keep an eye on their pursuers. If one of them fell to the ground, they would likely be trampled to death. This is where the skeletons came in handy. Blom! With another strike of her bracelets, they reached the cafeteria. There was a lot of space in the cafeteria, with 6 long tables separated by about 2 meters, and each table was about 10 meters long. It was a wide and open space that could accommodate about 100 people eating at the same time. Now the double doors they had passed through earlier exploded as a wave of infected people rushed toward them. You or me? Diana asked as they stopped running in the center of the cafeteria. As much as it's fun to run around drawing attention, I think I'll stay here and hold off them. Dio replied while handing her the glass vial containing the gas. Diana was still a few floors below, not far from the ones they had already cleared. It shouldn't take her long to attract their attention and return. Until then, Dio had to keep everyone here entertained to prevent them from killing each other. Enjoy yourself then. Diana said this and ran toward the door on the opposite side that led to the stairs. This is like a scene from a zombie movie. Dio said this aloud while looking at the mass of infected individuals flooding the room. Dio removed his shield and sword while placed the shield on the ground, and held it at the top of the side. I've always wanted to try this. Dio raised his sword above his head and infused it with a bit of his magical energy. When his enemies were just a meter away, he brought the sword down while hitting the top side of the shield with the pommel. Boom! A spherical explosion of dark energy sent everyone in front of him flying and knocked down almost all the infected people who had been running toward him. I hope Diana won't be mad that I borrowed her trick. Dio said it with a smile. With a thought, the 2 skeletons that had been by his side advanced. They leaped over those on the ground and attacked those still coming through the double door, but they were overwhelmed and buried. Attacking head-on was definitely a mistake. Dio thought to himself as he watched his skeletons disappear and sending them back to the underworld. Boom! PSSM. A gun and an energy weapon were then drawn from behind the wave and used to attack those who hadn't been hit by Dio's energy blast. Dio dodged to the left and reached a metal table. He grabbed the bottom of it and threw it up, which made it stand vertically before it fell onto them. Dio climbed onto another table and ran across it to get to the shooters. He cut both of their weapons before they could fire again and hit them in the face with his shield. Then he jumped back to avoid being overwhelmed by the people. Επικαλούμε το κρύο της λήψης του ποταμού και ως αίτιες. I summoned the cold of the river Cocytus. Dio swung his sword, which was now wrapped in ice. He sent a black mist across the floor that froze everyone to his left. When Dio tried to do the same thing on the right, something hit him in the face, and they used his shock to bring him down. Dio received many kicks, punches, and beatings before he used a shadow movement and appeared on the far left table. Boom! Dio struck his sword against his shield again to get their attention. They couldn't afford to lose sight of him for long, or they would start fighting each other. Bang! 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 A few infected soldiers who were further back had taken up a machine gun and begun to fire. Dio raised his shield to cover his body. The shield held up perfectly against the bullets, and he hoped it would continue to do so until their ammunition ran out. It could be dangerous to dodge. Unfortunately, the infected had also gotten up on the tables next to him and hit me with batons. Dio was unable to avoid the bullets because doing so would hit them. So, he stomped on the table with all his strength while breaking the iron table and bringing all of them down to ground level. The man with the machine gun lost his target and was about to lower his gun, but the Dio hit him, cut his gun in half, and then gave him a hard kick in the face. Επικαλούμε το κρύο της λήψης του ποταμού και ως αίτιες. I summoned the cold of the river Cocytus. Dio swung his sword again and sent a wave of cold across the ground that froze the feet of more infected people. Dio might have been able to freeze the whole room if he hadn't been fighting and using up so much energy since at Dr. Psycho. But he wasn't at his peak right now. Bong! Dio tilted his head back and narrowed it to avoid another energy blast that passed close to his nose. Dio spun his body around and threw his shield at the one who had fired it. Where on earth had they gotten so many energy weapons? Bong! The sound this time didn't come from him. It was near the stairs on the other side of the cafeteria. It didn't take long for Diana to reappear through the door. She wasn't injured, but she was carrying a man on her shoulder. Steve. Catch! Diana shouted and threw something at him. Dio jumped into the air and placed his shield on his back to catch the small glass vial containing the nerve gas. Go! Diana said as she jumped and landed in the middle of the cafeteria, right where he had been standing before. There were people who were passed out and others whose feet were frozen in place. It seemed Dio had underestimated the number of infected people on the floor below, which was why she couldn't lure them and break the vial in the ventilation. When Dio hit the ground, he immediately obeyed her order. After kicking an infected person who was in front of him in the face, he used shadow movement to appear in front of the stairwell door and continued teleporting in short jumps. Dio could have easily teleported there if he had seen the ventilation system before or brought a map of the building. Unfortunately, he hadn't thought of that before. Dio must have used his teleportation about 20 times. There was a lot of chaos, and this really drained his energy. After what seemed like a long time, he finally started to gasp, which only happened when he first started practicing magic and couldn't keep his magic from leaving his body. The good news is that Diana did an incredible job gathering all the infected. Dio didn't encounter any of them along the way. Only corpses. Boom! Dio kicked the locked ventilation room door. The inside of the room was a big metal cube with several fan units about the size of small houses that were always running and sending fresh air to each floor through ducts in the ceiling. Dio thrust his sword into the metal casing and made a square cut. He kept the sword and created an opening in the metal by bending it with his hands. Then he took the glass vial and threw it into the fan. Dio heard it shatter, and shortly after, he detected a strange smell in the air. Dr. October had told them that there were no bad effects on his body. Dio rushed back to the cafeteria and ran as fast as he could, but avoided teleporting to avoid collapsing from exhaustion before everything here was resolved. A minute later, Dio entered the cafeteria and witnessed a spectacular scene. Diana stood up and dragged 2 bodies across the floor to the middle of the room. It was really hard to do because the floor was covered in bodies. "Hurry, we don't have much time," Diana shouted and reminded him of the time. Dio immediately went to the back of the cafeteria and used the internal line to call Dr. October's laboratory, informing her of the situation. Then, Dio joined Diana to help. They began gathering all the infected together. "Everyone spread out," a voice in the room shouted while Dio raised his head and saw who it was. Dr. Victoria October entered through the door while limping with her cane, and behind her were several other individuals in lab coats. They were the same ones who had been in a panic in her lab a while ago. They all carried small red cases. "I want groups of 4, each in a different position, applying the antidote," Victoria ordered, and everyone behind her moved accordingly. Diana and Dio started working, gathering as many people as they could, and Diana extended her lasso as far as possible to heal them. Since they couldn't heal all of them at once, they had to do it repeatedly to ensure success. Shortly after, the group under Dr. October's supervision issued the antidote immediately because, once healed, the adrenaline levels started to decrease, which could lead to death. They continued gathering, healing, vaccinating, and repeating until they were certain that everyone was okay. "I've already sent someone to heal those you left unconscious along the way, so don't worry about them," Victoria reassured them and reminded them of this. Boom! "Where are you, you bitch?" A new person walked in through the cafeteria door. It was Dr. Psycho, who was yelling and staring at Diana. Dr. Psycho looked awful. He was covered in blood and dust, and his face was swollen and bruised. "Really? This idiot managed to escape from the iron bar around his body, and the next thing he does is come here and yell at Diana." "I'll regain my lost honor," Dr. Psycho shouted again. Dio used the shadows again because he was sick of him and hoped that would be the last time he did so today. Dio appeared behind Dr. Psycho and grabbed him by his hair, and then he pushed his face into the ground with a considerable amount of force. Boom! This time, he would take a while to wake up. "On the other side." That was a risky move. A voice spoke, and it wasn't possible to tell if it was male or female. "It was a success, wasn't it?" Another voice asks with a man, a powerful and strong voice that would intimidate any adult. The conversation was happening in a dark room with only a hologram sitting in front of a square table, giving off light. The hologram was merely an energy form and showed no distinct features. On the other side of the table sat a man who was sitting back in his chair and hiding his body. The only visible part of him was his hand, which tapped lightly on the table. Yes, the mission was a success, but now Wonder Woman, the League, and their protégé will do everything to find us. We've decided to proceed with maximum secrecy until the final plan, not to mention that the stolen item has an obvious connection to you. The hologram continued. "I know that, and I confess my subordinate didn't act as planned." "Well, then she should take the blame for her actions." "Not yet. She's very useful and did an excellent job covering her tracks. It will take them a while to find her, so we'll take advantage of that." "And what about your identity?" the hologram asked. "I highly doubt Amazon will connect this item to me because of the virus." "I agree, but what if they get too close? Then we'll activate the contingency plans we've created. If it comes to that, we'll start with the kids." The man suggested it while laughing at his own cruelty. Let it be then. The hologram finished and ended the conversation. I'm heading back to the Areopagus. Call me if you have something to discuss. With that message, the man disappeared from the room, and shortly afterward, the hologram vanished too, which left everything in darkness. Chapter 73. Chapter 72. With all the infected people in the cafeteria cured, Diana and Dio conducted a final inspection of the entire facility to ensure they hadn't missed anyone. They ended up finding some survivors, who were immediately taken to the cafeteria, where they received the antidote for the nerve gas and the golden lasso. It took a while, but they finally finished this work. However, the day was far from over. After saving the last of the infected, Diana, Dr. Psycho, and Dio left the base to Dr. Victoria and John. They flew to the city where it all began. Both of them wanted answers about what happened at ARGUS, but the only one who could provide them was Steve, who was unconscious. Dio could try to awaken him with magic, but he had never tried that on someone infected with a virus and nerve gas, so it was better to wait. In addition, he had been controlled, so they needed someone with the ability to free him if he was still under their influence. Diana used the phone to call for help, which was on its way. The reason they returned to this small town was to explain to the authorities what had happened and hand over the responsible party. A city being controlled by a madman is not a simple matter, and both of them needed to provide thorough information on the events. It didn't take long for them to arrive in the city. There was a man in a long blue cape floating with his back to them, and his hands on both sides of his head. Diana stopped flying right in the middle of it, a few meters above the ground. It's good to see that you're well, Diana, John said without turning. Kyrix, this is John Johns of Mars. Diana introduced. John Johns turned to face Dio. It's good to see you too, John said with a smile. Just like in the comics, John Johns was a tall green-skinned male with no hair, red eyes, and a suit of long blue pants, and his upper body was covered only by two red straps forming an X on his chest. It's a pleasure to meet you too, Martian Manhunter, Dio replied. He was undoubtedly one of the most powerful beings in the world at the moment, and few gave him the respect he deserved. In comic books, he is almost as strong as Superman, and his psychic powers are even stronger than Xavier's in the Marvel Universe. He can also heal from injuries, even regrowing limbs that have been cut off. He's best known for his limitless shape-shifting. In some versions of the DC Universe, fire, which can be either physical or mental, or a combination of the two, can kill Martians. In short, don't provoke or underestimate the Martian. How's the situation in the city? Diana inquired. I'm waking up the last sleepers now, John replied while turning and looking down at the city. With Dio's vision, he could see that the city was much more active now. A large portion of the population had been awakened, and they appeared frightened and confused, but at least they were behaving. Your students' team helped a lot, John continued while looking down. Two women were flying in their direction, Starfire and Raven in their suits. Dio, you're okay, Starfire exclaimed while excitedly pulling him out of Diana's arms and giving me a mid-air hug. I'm fine, Starfire. Remember to use code names. Dio reminded her and tried not to lose his breath from her tight squeeze. She was very worried, Raven added with her face covered by her purple hood, as she looked at him from a distance. What about you? Were you worried? Dio asked. It makes me more angry than worried. What kind of friend goes on a rescue mission and doesn't take his friend along? Raven asked while holding him by the shoulders and pulling him away to look at her stern face, an attempt to appear angry that only made her look adorable. Is everyone here? Diana asked and changed the subject. They arrived a short while ago. Everyone is helping with moving the injured and restoring order, John replied. Is it very bad? Diana asked. The residents aren't severely injured, but the city systems are damaged. It will take some time for everything to return to normal, John responded. They were mentally controlled. They will never return to normal, Raven commented, and Dio agreed with her. That was something that everyone knew, so they all looked down and were quiet for a while. They've arrived. John interrupted their silence and looked behind Dio. Others looked back at him, but he couldn't see because he couldn't fly. This is embarrassing, Dio said it aloud. Raven gave him one of her silent smiles, and then a shiny black disc appeared at Dio's feet. Then, Starfire released him. Dio turned around and noticed a cloud of dust on the road leading into the city from the approaching vehicles. Military, Dio asked while looking at the camouflaged green vehicles. There's a nearby base, so they have the authority to handle situations like this, John answered. And the media, as always, is right behind, Diana commented, and Dio could also see several vans of various colors following closely behind the military vehicles. Good luck with them, Dio said to her, and then he looked at Starfire. Let's land and help our friends, Dio told her. Hold on, Dio. We need to take him to the authorities. The League always explains what happened to the media when there's time for it. Diana said. Speaking of that, I'm new to Earth's customs, but is it wrong to take a man like this? Starfire pointed at Dr. Psycho, who was tied up and hanging from Diana's golden lasso while attached to her waist. He was still unconscious. Otherwise, he would be screaming right now. He's the villain who enslaved these people. Usually, I treat them with dignity, but let's just say he exceeded my patience. Diana explained. Wait, it seems like this will be easier than I thought. I see a friend among the reporters. Let's talk to her and get this over with. Diana said. Without saying anything more, she flew ahead, and when she passed by Dio's side, she grabbed his arm and pulled him towards the main street of the city, where the military and the media had parked their vehicles. This is getting ridiculous already. I swear by all the gods that I will learn to fly before the next mission. I won't leave my room until I achieve that. She, gently, left Dr. Psycho with one of the soldiers and quickly told them what happened. Then she went into the middle of the media, which left Dio a few steps behind to acknowledge Wonder Woman. They all pointed their cameras at them and raised their microphones. Wonder Woman, can you tell us what happened here? Was this an attack from another country or an alien invasion? Was a meta-human responsible? They shouted their questions all at once before allowing them to speak. It's good to see you again, Lois. How are things back home? Diana asked while ignoring the other reporters, and she addressed the one who didn't shout questions. Unlike all the others holding microphones, the woman was holding a recorder. Of course, Dio recognizes her as Lois Lane, a woman of average height with short black hair at face level and blue eyes. She was wearing a women's dress shirt and a long black skirt, and he must add that this woman's beauty is at a super level. Work as always remains fun, but it seems not to be as much fun as yours. Lois replied. I'm surprised to see you here, far from your city. Diana continued. I was nearby investigating a certain company when I heard about the commotion. Any comments on what happened? Lois asked in a professional tone. When people began to wake up because of the Martian Manhunter, they probably still had memories of the time they were controlled, so the kids immediately posted about it online, which attracted the media. Dio can't blame them. He would do the same. A few hours ago. Diana began to tell the story. What surprised Dio was that everyone listened quietly and didn't say anything. They didn't even have the guts to get into Diana's or his personal space. Of course, this is out of fear and respect, but for her. So, a misogynistic lunatic controlled the city to satisfy his desire to create his own harem with you as the leader? Lois asked when the story ended. Exactly. Diana confirmed. Since when did the world turn into the plot of a hentai anime? Lois asked while surprising herself with what had happened. They all looked at her like she was a strange animal, which was pretty funny. She is, but she's also very smart. From what Dio remembers from his world, newspapers were almost useless due to advanced technology. They were just trying to do everything they could to stay alive. In this reality, the Daily Planet is the first thing anyone should look for if they really want to know what's going on in the world. Lois is responsible for most of the investigation articles. The woman doesn't mind entering a war zone or invading a small country to get the story. It benefits to have an all-powerful red and blue guardian angel, but she does most of the work by herself, and her articles have brought down tyrants, kings, Zoas, officials, and politicians. Dio has enormous respect for her. Chapter 74. Chapter 73. And you, Kirix, what did you think of your first adventure with your teacher? Lois asked, and she turned her microphone toward him. It wasn't very pleasant, but I'm glad we somehow succeeded. Dio replied in a very serious tone. This is the second interview he participated in, and he still gets nervous about it. When he is nervous, his serious tone takes over. That was quite formal, but I think your fans will appreciate you being so mature. Lois said. Fans? What? I have fans. Dio asked with confusion. A fan club too, what? You didn't know? You're a big sensation among teenagers, and it only grew when you entered the ranks of the most handsome teenage heroes. Lois explained it and was clearly amused by it. There's a ranking? Dio asked with surprise. Looks like I need to stay more active on the internet. Cat Grant is to blame if you want to find someone to blame. She started these contests. She said, and the way she said Cat's name makes it clear she doesn't like her. The heroes always attract attention, Kirix, so it's not surprising that your looks win you some admirers. But please, don't be like the Flash. Diana advised him. I know that heroes are always in the spotlight, but I didn't imagine I'd attract so much attention in such a short time. Dio said. You and your friends debuted by saving one of the world's biggest cities, and then you were revealed to be a godlike being like Diana. You were noticed because of that, and how good you look. Lois said. Demigod. Dio corrected. Let's not get into the discussion of whether Greek gods really exist, please. I've had enough of that conversation with her. Lois said this while looking at Diana. Dio looked at Diana because he didn't understand what she was saying. A significant part of the world doesn't accept that the Greek gods are real. They think my origin is just a delusion or a backstory in which Wonder Woman is just a character. I'm one of those who think the ancient gods are nothing more than superpowered beings from another world who came to Earth. Lois offered her opinion. Well, Dio can't blame most people for not believing in gods. The DC world is pretty crazy, but the mystical side is often more mysterious and doesn't attract much attention. But maybe another perspective on this could change my mind. What do you think, Kirix? How about a personal interview? Lois asked while looking at him with expectant eyes. I'm sorry, Mississippi Lane, but at the moment, I can't accept. Maybe another day. Dio declined the invitation. She was about to say something else when Dio heard someone screaming furiously at the city's entrance. Long hours trapped, tied to a jet with no water or food. The screams echoed from afar. It was Etta Candy, Diana's best friend and the woman Dio had forgotten, in the middle of a plantation while tied to a chair. I have to go. My friends are waiting for me, Dio said and did the smartest thing to do right now. He used the shadows to leave everyone behind, including the reporters, Lois, and Diana. Dio jumped from one building to another until he reached the city center, where on a rooftop stood Robin, with his back to him and Aqualad at his side. Hey guys! Dio greeted them while standing beside them. How's the situation at ARGUS? Robin asked as he surveyed the situation below. There are several casualties. Dio replied in a serious tone. And the enemy's objective? Robin inquired again. It's still a mystery, but we'll have answers in a few hours. I'm sorry for your loss, my friend. Aqualad comforted him and placed his hand on his shoulder. Did you find out anything? Dio asked Robin and wanted to change the subject. I saw the whole situation through the city's cameras, but those who fired at you used anti-spy technology, so the cameras didn't help at all. However, one of them left a capsule behind. I'll analyze it when I get to the tower. Robin replied. Hey, shouldn't the League be the one getting this? Aqualad asked. I'll share the results with them. Or are you doubting my forensic skills? At the end of his sentence, Robin looked at Aqualad, and even the calm Aqualad was left speechless. I wouldn't be too hopeful about that. These guys are experts, and I doubt their ammunition is traceable. Dio said. I'm not just looking for the origin of the bullets. I'm examining everything, even the traces of the environment it was exposed to before being loaded and fired. But you're right, there are very few groups with this level of preparation and skill, but it's worth trying. Robin explained. Are you just going to chat up here? A voice behind them asked. Dio turned and saw Starfire floating with her arms crossed while looking at them. I was giving Robin an update. Dio defended himself. I know, I'm still not happy about you going on an adventure alone, but we'll talk about it in tomorrow's training. Starfire said that and then flew off to help people. While everyone else helped, the three of them were left behind. Raven was even carrying some hurt people to the first aid tent. She's right, there's a lot of work to be done. Robin said. Are you coming? Aqualad asked Dio. I think the people down there won't want to be helped by the one responsible for their injuries. Dio replied. Kirix is right. He still needs to report the incident to the military. Robin added. All right, see you later. Aqualad jumped from the first floor and landed safely, then walked calmly toward the medical tent. Oh, one more thing that deserves some attention. Dio remembered. What is it? Robin asked. Wonder Woman told me that someone is undermining Steve's power, probably aiming for his position. And do you think this person might have something to do with this incident? Robin quickly understood. The role of the head of ARGUS carries a lot of power and authority, so it makes sense if someone wanted it. That person might try something like this. Dio gave his opinion. I'll work on that. Thank you, Robin. Don't thank me. It's my role as a leader. Robin replied while pointing a black device skyward, and a cable shot from it while connecting to the building across the street. Go talk to the military quickly. It's a pain in the ass, but it has to be done. Robin said before jumping from the building and swinging to another. I hate dealing with authorities. The military leader was easy to find. He was in the only tent set up in the middle of the makeshift camp, surrounded on all sides by armed soldiers. Save me from your nonsense. A voice from inside the tent shouted, which made all the guards outside tense. Dio leaped and landed in front of them, and they pointed their weapons at him. I guess my teacher is inside. Dio spoke calmly and avoided sudden movements. The guard in front of him lowered his weapon and nodded for him to enter. Inside the tent, there was only a table with a map above it, and behind it was a middle-aged man with short white hair and wearing standard army clothing. Diana stood in front of him with her arms crossed. Do you really expect me to believe that a metahuman took over an entire city just to capture you? Sam yelled again. Believe it or not, General, that's the truth. Diana replied calmly. Who the hell are you? Sam shouted at Dio. His son, actually. Dio said it jokingly. The vein on the general head began to pulse, and Dio realized it was a bad idea to joke right now. Kirix, this is General Sam Lane. You met his daughter today. Diana introduced him and tried to defuse the situation. Great, I've met 2 members of the Lane family in one day. Unfortunately, her father is an idiot who is jealous of his daughter's affection and views about Superman. So you're the boy we're keeping an eye on. Sam said. It's good to know that the government spends its time watching its heroes instead of the villains. Dio joked. It's not in my nature to start conflicts, but this guy has something about him that really irritates me. Don't be an idiot. We watch everyone. Sam replied while sitting in a simple iron chair and still looking at them. Kirix, could you confirm what I told the general? Diana asked. So, Dio recounted what happened to them in the city, and Sam just listened until the end of the story. Finally he asked, where's the device? Crap, I knew I forgot something. It stayed on the ground after it broke. Dio replied. I flew over the site of our battle a bit earlier, and the device was taken. A way to protect those responsible. Diana said. In any case, the report has been made, and now we need to go, General. Diana continued, and without waiting for permission or caring about it, Diana grabbed Dio's arm, which dragged him out of the tent. What happened? Dio asked outside. Steve woke up. Diana replied while still holding on to him, and they flew back to the ARGUS headquarters. After some time flying at high speed, they arrived at their destination. This time, they didn't land on the top floor of the building. Instead, Diana flew directly to one of the lower floors and entered through an already open window. The inside of the room was quite small by the facility's standards. A small medical room where Steve was lying. Next to the bed, there were monitoring devices for his heart rate and blood pressure, as well as 4 connected to his vein. Steve wasn't alone in the room. On the bed next to him, Zatanna was dressed like a stage magician with a top hat on. She had her hand on Steve's face. And he was asleep. It's been a while, Z. Dio greeted Zatanna. You haven't learned to fly yet? Zatanna teased him. How is he? Diana asked while positioning herself on the other side of Steve's bed. Don't worry, Diana. I'm just doing a final check, he's fine. Zatanna replied. She then snapped her fingers over Steve's face, and he opened his eyes. Hey, Angel. Steve was the first to speak and looked at Diana. Hello, soldier. Diana replied with a gentle smile. Well, my work here is done. I have to go now. I have a performance at 9. Zatanna said this and looked at the wall clock in the room. She turned and pointed to the door of the room. Blom! With an explosion, a circular vortex of pure blue magical energy appeared in front of her. Don't be in a bad mood, my apprentice. It will be possible for you to open portals like this in the future. Zatanna bid farewell with another teasing remark as she walked toward the vortex. Thank you, Zatanna. Diana said this before Zatanna stepped through the vortex and disappeared along with it. Chapter 75. Chapter 74. How long have you been awake? Diana asked while looking at a stack of papers on the bedside table. A few minutes. While Zatanna was checking my mind for anything wrong, I caught up. Steve replied. We'll discuss why you didn't tell me immediately when you woke up when we're alone. It's still strange to see her acting like an ordinary girlfriend. Hey, how's it going, kid? They told me you caused quite an uproar at the base as well. Steve greeted him with a smile. It wasn't easy. Dio replied and went to the other side of the bed. So, what the hell happened? Dio asked. Steve's smile disappeared, and he pressed a button on the side of the bed, causing the front part of it to rise, which allowed him to sit up. We're still evaluating the whole mess, but their objective was quite clear. Steve began. And what was it? Diana asked this time. The Black Room was breached. Steve said, and from Diana's reaction, this is a big deal. For those who don't know about the ARGUS secret zones, what is the Black Room? Dio asked. Diana was the one who answered him. The Black Room is a secret location within the ARGUS headquarters where magical and mystical objects of great power are locked away. I walked through the entire headquarters and never saw any signs of a secret room. That's why they're called secret places, Dio. They're not easy to find. Steve said. If this place is so secret, how did the culprits find out about it? Dio asked. That's what I'm trying to figure out. The Odd Fellows at ARGUS are the only ones who know about it. Steve explained. The Oddfellows are well known within ARGUS, the elite group led by Steve, with Wonder Woman as a member and 4 others Dio never met. Is the whole group okay? Diana asked while worried about her friends. I got in touch with 3 of them, but Juniper still isn't responding. Steve replied with concern. That's not a good sign. What did they do in that room? Dio then asked about the purpose of all the bloodshed. They took only one item. Which one? Ares Labries. After spending another 4 hours at the ARGUS headquarters, Dio finally returned to the tower. When the elevator doors opened, he was greeted by all the Teen Titans, who were in their suits and looked like they hadn't returned long ago from a mission. What did I do this time? When Dio asked, he wasn't feeling very excited and just wanted to lie down for a while, even though he wasn't really tired. Man, you chose to walk into an enemy trap all by yourself. That's what happened. Wally replied as he chewed on a bag of potato chips. I know you can be stupid, but this takes the cake. Roy added while his arms crossed. Yes, legendary battles like this should be shared with your friends. There's no need to solo them. Dio thinks Coriandar didn't quite grasp the real purpose of this meeting. Guys! Dio raised his hand to stop Robin from speaking. I know I messed up, and I promise I won't do it again. Once again, I apologize, but in the name of all the gods, please let me take a shower. We can continue this conversation after a long bath, with a slice of pizza in my hands. Good idea, Wally said, and then ran off to the nearest pizzeria. All right, it's settled. Without saying another word, Dio teleported to the upper floor and headed straight for the bathroom, where he took a long, refreshing shower as promised. Afterwards, he went straight to his room while wearing only a pair of shorts because no one wanted to keep talking over a hearty meal. Dio collapsed on his bed, which allowed him to relax for the first time that day. Ah! Dio exclaimed while savoring the sensation. Unfortunately, he still couldn't fall asleep. The first thing Dio did was pick up his phone, which was lying next to his bed, and check his messages. Vanessa had sent him some messages asking if he was okay, and the last one talked about his recent TV appearance. Dio texted Vanessa to let her know he was fine, then turned off his phone and placed it on the table before closing his eyes. Dio still remembered what it was like to have a human body, so his unlimited stamina was always a nightmare for him. So he didn't fall asleep immediately, even though he was mentally exhausted. Dio had used a lot of magic today, and he should have been out, but he was getting stronger. It became less energy as he used more spells because he was used to them. So, Dio began to think about all the future problems he would face. The biggest of them was the emergence of a new organization that seemed to be much smarter and more secretive than the Church of Blood. In addition, they now had the Labries of Ares. There was one special thing that only that god had. Those focused on battle had weapons like Zeus' lightning bolt, Poseidon's trident, and Hades' helm. These unique items were forged with magic and power, and when used by the gods, their power was immense. The Labries of Ares was the item of the god of war, a double-bladed axe that Diana and the Justice League of Justice had taken from Ares after their victory over the god of war during World War II. The item had been in Diana's possession until she chose to store it in the ARGUS Black Room, where it remained until today. The good news was that the responsible party behind this wasn't Ares himself, who was imprisoned in a prison constructed by Hephaestus, a place where not even the gods could escape. It was hidden in an isolated and secret location. Diana was almost sure that the children of Ares were behind all this, just as they had been the first time the virus was used. With these thoughts, Dio finally drifted off to sleep. Chapter 76. Chapter 75. It's been a month since the ARGUS attack, and there has been no progress in the investigation. The only update in the case is another piece of bad news. Agent Zara Abed, a member of the Oddfellows responsible for guarding and managing the Black Room, was found dead a few days later. Zara's body showed signs of torture, and Diana and Steve are still mourning her. Zara was the youngest member of the Oddfellows, and they were all now waiting for their enemy to appear once again to make them pay. Steve also faced political problems due to the attack. He wasn't fired only because of the work done so far, but he was severely punished, being removed from the ARGUS command and demoted to deputy leader. The new leader of ARGUS hasn't shown their face yet, only sending orders remotely to everyone. According to Diana, there is much conflict now because of the new leader. Luckily, Steve still has the complete loyalty of the ARGUS personnel keeping things in check. Dio's idea that the new leader might be involved in the attack led to nothing. Robin spent days in the command room of the tower searching for evidence, but even he couldn't discover the identity of the new leader or any proof of their involvement. In addition, the analyzed bullets didn't provide much. All that was discovered was that they originated from Japan, which wasn't very helpful. There were no leads, so there was nothing to do but keep living. The days passed, and Dio kept his promise to focus all my attention and time on his new spells. Finally, there was improvement. Dio hasn't progressed any further because he has to spend a lot of time being a hero. There haven't been any unusual incidents, but they still had to deal with a few accidents and rescues in the city. These actions help them work together better, and now the Titans are becoming more well-known and are seen as an official and famous team in the city. Dio also checked out what Lois Lane told him. He has a fan club. Dio was very embarrassed by this, and the embarrassment only increased when Wally found a romantic fanfic between him and Roy. It's common for heroes to have stories like these, but no one dares write anything bad about Batman. Then Dio became the first, but that's another story. After the acknowledgement of the fanfic between me and Roy, the first collaborative mission between them outside of hero work happened. The mission's objective was to chase, capture, and torture Wally, who enjoyed searching for these perverted stories and showing them to their friends. It was hard to complete the mission because Wally is very fast, but they were able to catch him with a simple trap in which they spent all their money on food. The rest is just between them three, but Dio assures himself that he will never do something like that again. The problem is that the damage has already been done, and Coriandar, who should be his best friend, has developed a great taste for such works. Raven too, but at least she does a better job of hiding it from others, but the looks she gives him haven't escaped his senses. This was a brief summary of what happened this month, and now Dio is on his third trip abroad. Unfortunately, Dio was here for work and not for fun like the others. An enormous tsunami hit a small town in Indonesia 6 hours ago and caused a lot of destruction. They called them when the League got there because they didn't have enough manpower at the time. When they finally made it to the island 2 hours later, the sight was devastating. It was different from seeing a war zone, but there were also many similarities. The entire city was overturned, with remains, cars, boats, and trees all scattered in pieces. There was no way for the water to flow, so houses fell down and the streets were flooded. There was so much damage that the fact that people were still alive could be seen as a miracle, but that won't last for long. The majority of them are buried and won't last much longer. Here! Dio shouted to Raven, who was right beside him. She raised her hand, and her eyes began to glow. Then, a massive piece of concrete wall is enveloped by her shining black energy while floating in the air. Dio moves quickly while removing various smaller debris until a small room is revealed where a man is holding onto his little daughter. Their whole bodies are covered in dust and water. When the man saw the light again, he saw him as the only thing that could save him. It's okay. Give me the child first. Dio told them and the man did. The child is sleeping, so there is no noise. After taking the child, Dio looked back and shouted, "Over here." A man dressed in white took the child from his arms. He was one of those assisting in the rescue. Then, Dio helps the father of the child out of the hole as well, and he follows the girl through the debris to the medical tents. They thanked him with tears in their eyes before they left. "I didn't know you could speak their language." Raven said this and gently lowered the debris she was levitating. "I don't speak it. It's a simple spell. I can teach you later." Dio said this while walking to the next location. Those with heightened senses are an asset in searching for trapped people. Unfortunately, there aren't many heroes with this ability on site, so Dio has to move quickly. Superman and the Martian Manhunter have already cleared the zones assigned to them and are heading to the next. Dio was just getting started. If Diana were here, they could work faster, but she was called away for some reason by her mother and is currently unreachable. Rum! On the other side of the street, Dio heard a structure collapsing. Dio looked over and saw a 2-story building about to collapse. He examined its structure, and he didn't see anyone trapped inside, but then he noticed some movement in the front window of the second floor. Trum! A large part of the second floor simply detaches and falls to the side. Dio didn't have time to tell Raven. She was too far away. So, he sprints at full speed and appears right below where the floor is about to fall. Dio bent his knees, and a large amount of black smoke exploded from his feet, which enveloped half of his body and propelled him upwards. He raises both arms above his head to hold it as the building collapses toward him. Dio stayed still in the air, and he was finally flying. After a long time, Dio finally managed to create his flying spell. It wasn't easy, but it was worth it. The spell allows him to control hypothetical graviton particles, which let him defy gravity and fly however he wants. Superman does the same thing, but he is still far inferior in speed compared to him, but he can now break the sound barrier. Dio was happy with this achievement. He even received approving applause from Zatanna when he demonstrated the spell to her. However, there is one thing about him that has become a running joke. Whenever he uses this spell, which doesn't require speaking, he releases black smoke that covers his body and leaves a dark trail wherever he goes. Wally called him Voldemort because he casts a spell similar to the one in the movies. Dio didn't mind too much, and he liked it. Raven! Dio shouted for a signal. The weight isn't bothering him, but the structure is starting to crumble, and he can hear a heartbeat in the piece above him. I've got this. Dio sees water rising from his side and touching the broken structure. The water freezes and turns into columns holding the place. Dio moves quickly while making a U-turn, flying through the ice columns and entering the broken building. Dio sees an unconscious woman on the inside, but with a pulse. Dio grabs her and exits the site. Thanks for the help, Aqualad. Dio thanked Aqualad while landing next to him. Sorry, I couldn't get here sooner. Raven apologizes and lands next to them as well. Teamwork, Raven. Dio said to her with a smile. Did you finish your work? Dio asked Aqualad. He should be with his king. Somehow, they were going to prevent another tsunami. The king is currently making the final adjustments. My assistance is no longer needed. Aqualad replied while putting away the 2 silver devices that he uses to control water. Good to know. Dio said. Allow me to take her to the healers, my friend. You are more needed here. Aqualad said while approaching. Dio placed the unconscious woman in his arms. This is Robin to Kirix. What is the situation? Robin's voice came through Dio's communicator. Dio tapped it to open the channel and responded. The situation is moving pretty slowly because the buildings are in bad shape. You're already moving faster than everyone else, and the situation requires caution, but we need you in the city center. We have a situation with multiple casualties. Robin spoke urgently. I'm on my way. Will you continue the search? Dio asked Raven. Yes, I'll use my astral projection to explore the rubble and look for survivors. It'll be slower than your method but much faster than a regular search. Raven said while sitting on the uncomfortable ground littered with debris. Chapter 77. Chapter 76. Dio lowered his knees and shot into the sky like a black rocket. Dio never gets tired of this sensation. He ascends a few meters and stops while looking at the devastated view below. Dio turned his body to the south, where the city center was, and flew at high speed in that direction. Looking back, he saw a trail of black smoke marking the clear sky without clouds. Dio reached the city center in a matter of seconds. Since it was farther from the beach, the damages weren't as severe as the parts closer to the ocean. There are some buildings that are still standing. After scanning with his eyes for a few seconds, Dio finally found Robin. He's with Batman and Green Lantern while looking at the only building that collapsed. What's the problem? Dio asked and landed next to Robin. There. Robin points in front of him. Dio focuses his senses in that direction and detects several heartbeats below ground level. A parking lot? Dio asked. Yes, civilians thought it would be safer to hide there. Green Lantern answered. Since Green Lantern is here, why did you still ask for my help? Is it more complicated than it seems? Dio guess. Correct. The structure is too fragile for Green Lantern's constructs to pierce or remove, but your teleportation can change things. Batman told him their plan. Do you want me to create an explosion from the inside out? Dio asked in surprise and understood the plan. Exactly. That's insane. Dio refused, even knowing who he was talking to. Instead of answering, Robin raises his wrist, and a hologram shows various calculations and images of the underground. We determined how much energy would be needed and the perfect spot using mini-cameras. All you have to do is follow the plan. Robin explained. All right, but how in the name of the gods am I supposed to measure the percentage of energy in my punches? Dio asked with confusion. This time it was Batman who looked at him and replied. We don't want you to punch. We want you to use an energy explosion like you did in your fight against the infected at ARGUS. How in Hades' name do you know about that? Dio was more shocked. It's not easy to breach ARGUS security, but this guy got hold of the footage. That's not important right now. Focus. Batman responded coldly. Sigh. Dio sighs and focuses his full attention on the hologram. How much force will be needed compared to what I did at ARGUS? Dio asked. 4 times more. Robin replies. Is that possible? Batman asked. Yes, let's do this quickly. Dio respond. I'll get ready too. Green Lantern said and flew into the sky while covered in his green energy. Robin shows Dio the image of the situation below again and where he should teleport and hit. After memorizing everything, Dio teleported to the location. Dio had to crouch a bit to avoid hitting the ceiling. He is now facing a sizable piece of concrete that covers the exit. With more debris blocking the passage, Dio can hear the people trapped behind him. Dio takes his shield from his back with some difficulty due to the tight space and places it on the ground while pointing it toward the exit in front of him. Diana can release bursts of divine energy by hitting her 2 bracelets, which are made of divine metal capable of absorbing large amounts of energy, including her own. Unlike her, Dio learned how to manipulate the energy, so it's easier for him to do what she does. After using this move for the first time, Dio trained a bit with Coriandar and managed to unleash the same power without hitting 2 pieces of divine metal. So instead of hitting his shield, Dio advanced with it and hit the front part of it against the stone blocking the entrance. Boom! The black energy is projected forward, and Dio has to exert force so as not to be thrown backward. Suddenly, everything around him exploded, sending a huge piece of concrete flying into the air. The Green Lantern caught it and turned it into a huge green baseball glove. After that, the search and rescue continued for 2 days. Dio had never saved as many people in his short time as a hero as they did in those 2 days. They stayed for another day to help until NGOs and governments finally organized and arrived with help. Then they finally went back home. It was the first time Dio had participated in something like this. It was different from when he was in the war zone. He felt much more useful saving those who could be saved. Dio even used his healing spell to save some in critical condition. They will surely never thank him for that. But all of this is certainly part of a superhero's life, which is rarely shown in comics that focus more on action and drama. When they got home, everyone was completely worn out except Coriandar and Calder-HM. They didn't even take a bath. They just collapsed on the living room floor and passed out. It's scary enough that they made it here, so they deserve a rest. As for Calder-HM, Coriandar, and Dio, they went upstairs to the bathroom to take a shower. After that, Dio immediately went to his room, which was a mess at the moment. Dio's preparations for his first journey to the Underworld are almost complete. It was relatively easy to find a spell to open an entrance in Zatanna's library. There are a lot of spells that can take him to the Underworld because magicians and sorcerers love to travel to other realms because it's the easiest way to get ingredients or get stronger. In fact, Dio found 3 of them while using different forms. Dio wanted to test the easiest one before going in. The easiest spell allowed an astral projection to go to the Underworld. In this form, Dio couldn't interact with anything, but he could see and hear. Raven stopped him just as he was about to leave. She raised an important point. The Underworld is where souls are judged, punished, or elevated, so in his astral form, he'd likely be influenced by that. In Dio's mind, the easiest spell actually became the most dangerous. Dio had to do everything the hard way. He had to combine all the spells that would do what he wanted and change them to adapt them to himself. The problem was the materials needed to make it possible. Luckily, Dio managed to create the flight spell, which allowed him to gather everything he needed without needing help. Dio has almost everything he needs, except for one thing, which he hopes to get tomorrow. There is not much time. There's a time limit to have a chance to get this. If he doesn't do it tomorrow, he'll have to wait another 3 months. Dio rested on my messy bed for a few hours without caring about the mess in his room. A little noise outside Dio's room woke him up. Raven and Coriandar were talking at the end of the hallway when Dio suddenly opened the door behind them. They were startled. "What the hell noise is this?" Dio asked them. Coriandar, who had her arms crossed while looking at him, responded. "It's Raven who's acting strange. I don't understand why there is all this noise either." Dio looks at Raven, and she walks up to him and hands me a small, shabby card with just an address and phone number. The printed paper is also shabby. "What is this?" Dio asked her. Cori has the habit of flying around the city before sleeping. Today, she prevented a traffic accident, so a guy gave her this. He claims to be a modeling agent. Ravina explained while using Starfire's name. "Did he offer her a job?" Dio asked. "Yeah. Isn't it amazing, Dio?" Coriandar asked while excited about the idea. "It's not a surprise. This woman is on another level of beauty, and being from another planet, she will surely be successful. As far as Dio remembers, she worked as a model in the comics. Unfortunately, her next words made him understand why they were arguing. And all I have to do is take several nude photos and have fun with other men. Isn't it incredible?" Coriandar asked while smiling at Dio. "See," Ravina said while looking at Dio's shocked face. The culture of Tamarin is more open than that of Earth, so the idea of undressing is not a problem for Coriandar. She even mentioned that this is very common in sports on her planet, so she didn't notice the malice of the proposal from the idiot who made it. There is a limit between courage and stupidity, and this idiot blew past that limit. What did he think would happen when Coriandar found out about his plans? Go with the flow? Or maybe he didn't even realize that she didn't understand what he was proposing? "Cori, you didn't understand. Actually, this man has malicious intentions. Come here. Let me explain calmly." Dio spoke calmly to her. There's no use shouting at a Tamaranian. She'll just shout louder than him. It's best to remain calm. Finally, Coriandar agrees not to go after this job after being fully explained. "I can't believe he wanted to hire me as a prostitute. I have no prejudice against that line of work, but I am still a princess. I choose my lovers wisely," Coriandar said with her head bowed. "There will be other jobs for you, Cori, so don't worry. I'll even help you look. What do you think?" Dio asked and tried to cheer her up. "Okay." Coriandar shouted while returning to her happy self and flying downstairs, probably to eat something. Huff. Dio sighed. Now Dio has to find a job for her. It's like being friends with a shapeshifter who turns into a child every time she disagrees. Ravina said while also sighing. Friend, I didn't know you guys were friends. Dio said jokingly. She never seemed to accept Coriandar's friendship before. Ravina didn't respond. Instead, she passes through the floor and goes downstairs while escaping her embarrassment. How cute, Dio said while watching her escape. Dio lifts the card in his hand and looks at the address. I have a few hours before I leave. It won't hurt to make a small detour. Dio said it aloud with a tone full of anger. Chapter 78. Chapter 77. A little while after making a quick friendly visit to the talent recruiter who approached Coriandar, Dio began his trip to his destination for the night. He took a little longer than expected, but he was still on time. He thought the recruiter was just an idiot, but he stumbled upon a network of trafficking and blackmailing women. Dio blew everything up and freed the women who were trapped. The police acted immediately. Dio also obtained all the information about the network by reading the memories of 4 ghosts who were on the scene. They died in really sad ways by suicide and overdose. The network is spread across a few cities, but its headquarters are in Gotham. So Dio sent all this information to Robin, who forwarded it to Batman. This will be punishment enough for them. Batman has never been or will be kind to this kind of person. Everyone in Gotham knows that. It's a point that Batman made very clear to everyone through his brutality. The line that many stopped stepping over because of pedophilia or human trafficking. Dio predicts that several hospitals are receiving an abnormal number of disabled people today. It's 8 o'clock at night, and Dio is now facing his mirror while looking at his black suit with a white dress shirt underneath and a black bow tie. It's the kind of outfit he's never worn before, but it definitely suits him well, just like his new hairstyle. Dio let his snow-white hair grow a bit. He usually leaves it loose, but now he combed it back. Over time, Dio's face becomes increasingly mature. His skin is still pale and untouched, and his eyes are as black as 2 black holes. The suit goes perfectly with everything about him. Dio normally wouldn't dress like this, but the place he's going has a certain level, and he doesn't want to look bad by going in with just a white shirt and jeans on. So, Dio asked Dick for a suit. Dio owes him more and more favors. He has to remember that. Dio quickly leaves his room and goes to the elevator. The place is quiet at this hour, but all the people in the tower are not sleeping. The night is practically their working hours, and even though they are tired from the rescue that ended a few hours ago, they won't skip this day to rest. When Dio got off the elevator on the roof, she saw Raven sitting in the middle of the roof, 1 meter above the ground, with her legs crossed. There are also several candles floating around her body. The meditation is one of the ways Ravina is not influenced by her father, increasing her emotional control. This action is not very respected by the team since they don't know the real reason for Ravina's meditation. Dio walks quietly to the roof's edge to avoid bothering her. Are you going out? Raven asked with her eyes closed as he passed by her. Yes, I have to get the last item. Dio replied. She has helped him a lot with his research, so she knows about the last material. Take care. Raven stopped halfway through the sentence. She had her eyes closed until now, but she opened them and saw him, and it seems he looks good in this suit. What left you speechless? Dio teases her with a smile. I don't know what you're talking about. Just go. Raven shouted and closed her eyes, but her face was twisting with embarrassment. I've already informed Robin about this, but I have my communicator in case something goes wrong. Dio said as he walked to the edge. The view of the city in the horizon still awake with its bright lights never ceases to amaze him with its beauty. The night was also cloudless, which made it a perfect night to fly. Dio took his phone out of his pocket and opened the GPS before leaving. It's embarrassing, but even though he can fly now, it doesn't mean he knows the entire world map. Dio was not like Diana, who had been flying around for centuries. This time, the destination is far from where he is. At his maximum speed, Dio will reach it in about 4 hours of flight while crossing the entire country, but that only excites him. Dio was like a teenager who had just gotten his first car and was getting ready for his first long trip. See you later. Dio said goodbye to Ravina, who still refused to open her eyes, and then let himself freefall. When he is high above the buildings, he stops ascending and looks at the scene in front of him. The beautiful full moon and a sky covered with stars. Dio enjoyed this view for a few seconds and flew forward again while increasing speed every second. Boom! An explosion happened around him and pushed him even further forward at a frightening speed. Dio just broke the sound barrier. He is moving at about 1,200 kilometers per hour now. If Dio were a bit lower, he would be breaking all the glass and causing panic in the cities below as he passed in a flash. So, after 4.5 hours, Dio finally reached his destination while slowing down to see the city of San Francisco, California. San Francisco is a city with hills at the tip of a peninsula. It's not very large, but it has its beauty. While floating high above, Dio took out his phone and opened the GPS to find out where to go. It took 5 minutes to find the establishment in a dark and dirty alley without lighting. It was nothing more than a red door on the wall. Dio adjusted his hair and clothes, and he knocked on the door without hesitation. Knock, knock, knock. A small opening at eye level opens, and 2 red eyes look at me. What do you want? The person on the other side of the door asked with a dragging and unwilling voice. I want to enter at this moment. Dio replied. The eyes stared at him for a few seconds. What can't I? Dio asked, this time putting a bit of his energy into his eyes, which made them glow black. A small useless trick with no purpose other than to intimidate, which is actually always useful. The small opening closes, and he hears the knob being opened. The door opened shortly after, and when the door was open, Dio saw a white man, but not a healthy white, a sickly white, with red eyes from the inside of the door. A zombie. There are many categories of the undead, which are found in many cultures around the world. Dio would say it was made with alchemy based on its features and the fact that he knows who owns the place. Welcome. The zombie said this while bowing to him with difficulty. Dio put his hands in his pockets and entered through the front door. The inside of the place is very different from what anyone would expect from looking at the street it's located on. A big place with room for several tables and antique wooden chairs. There was a huge wooden counter on the left wall, and various drinks were displayed on the shelf on the wall behind it. Above the shelf with the drinks, there was a name written in red letters. Bewitched. It was a beautiful bar, but its customers were not normal. They were all werewolves, and Dio saw them drinking while dressed in suits and having hairy bodies. There are small fairies flying around the place. An older man with long horns and red skin was sitting further away and chatting happily with 2 women who had blue skin and no hair. There was also a cyclops playing darts against a faun on the other side of the hall. There were more than 10 different kinds of magical beings in this place, and they were all drinking and talking to each other. It was Dio's first time in a place like this, and he was a bit excited. Chapter 79. Chapter 78. Bewitched is a bar for mystical creatures. Tanarak is the owner of this place and also a powerful alchemist and sorcerer. Tanarak has been alive for centuries, since ancient Egypt, as far as others know. According to rumors, he bound his life to a statue, so he can't die unless the statue is destroyed, so it must be well guarded. He's not a good person. He fought the Phantom Stranger a few times and died, but the Lord of Chaos brought him back to life. It's unclear why he created this place, but Tanarak has followed the rules of neutrality and non-aggression ever since Bewitched was created. There were punishments for people who came here to cause trouble or start a fight. In this way, Bewitched Bar has become the most popular magical establishment in this part of the country. It was only for this reason that Dio risked stepping into the establishment of a man who serves the Lords of Chaos, who are way above him right now. With his suit and looks, Dio drew some attention from the bar's patrons, but they did nothing but give him a few glances. Dio didn't mind that and walked up to the counter while sitting on the red chair in front of it. It's still too early for someone like you to come to a place like this, pup. The bartender said it on the other side of the counter. Since Dio is in a magical bar, it makes sense that the bartender isn't human. A 3-meter-tall minotaur with long horns and a bull-like face is cleaning a glass with a cloth right in front of him. He is wearing a suit that doesn't look right on his unusually wide body. Are you going to ask for my ID? Dio said it jokingly. What does age matter to immortal races? I'm talking about your mentality. The minotaur replied while still wiping his glass. Judging my mentality by my appearance, that's a bit disappointing. I just don't want to be responsible for the death of the son of the Lord of the Underworld. The Minotaur replied and looked into his eyes. How do you know about my father? Dio asked. It's not a secret that Dio is a demigod, but he hasn't said anything about being the son of Hades to the media. You've been flaunting around as a hero with his symbol. Who doesn't know that the first demigod son of the Underworld was born? You were a hot topic not long ago. The Minotaur replied. That explains the looks I'm getting now. Understood, but don't worry, I didn't come here to drink. Dio said to him with a smile. So, why did you come? The Minotaur asked. To play. Crack. The glass in the Minotaur's hand cracks. Not childish but stupid. The Minotaur spoke again. We'll find out when the night is over. Dio wasn't offended by what he said, which makes sense given what he was about to do. Are you going to stop me? Dio asked. No, the master's orders are absolute. The game is open to everyone who wants to play. The Minotaur said this while pointing to a door on the other side of the bar. Dio stood up from the chair and walked to the door. This drew a lot of attention from everyone present. Whatever goes on behind this bar's door is known to everyone. Dio didn't care about the attention. He opened the door and descended the dimly lit stairs. When Dio reached the end of the corridor, he felt a strong magical energy enveloping the entire place. Instead of finding just a basement or some small dirty room, the place where he appeared is much larger than the top. A huge room 20 meters wide and long has several tables with all different types of gambling games happening on them. And all the tables are occupied by people playing. The place smells like cigars, alcohol, and sin. There are beautiful women in long red dresses with demon wings and horns who carry drink trays between the tables with grace. How rich is this damn Tanarak? Dio started walking across the room to the farthest tables, where poker games were going on. After all, no one was looking at him because everyone was focused on the games. Dio found 4 poker tables. The 3 of them have only 3 players, but the other 3 have 4. One of these tables is his target. Dio went to the table and stood behind the empty chair. "Can I play?" Dio asked those seated. The woman on the left had long red hair at shoulder length and pale skin. Her eyes were cold blue, and she was wearing a thick red lipstick that matched the matte eyeshadow around her eyes. She was wearing a long black dress with a V neckline without many details. Then she raised her glass of red wine and gave Dio a small smile. She took a sip and left some of the liquid on her lips, which made them even more red. The perfect vampire is stunningly beautiful and seductive. The man on the right was an old man with a long white beard that reached his navel and short white hair. He was clothed in a beige suit that screamed, ancient. The old man just gave him a kind smile, like a grandfather would to his grandson. But Dio can tell that this old man is a powerful wizard because he can feel the magic around him. Dio's not after either of them. The target was sitting in the front chair, a small demon about 1.5 meters tall, with orange skin, long ears pointing upward, and 2 lower fangs so large that they reached close to his eyes. He was wearing an old military helmet from World War II on top of his head. Bogrol is one of the gatekeepers of hell. The funny thing is that this job is not as important as its name indicates. There is no soul that has ever entered or exited through the gate of hell. There are souls that have left hell, but they were all helped by demons, and no one would try to escape hell through the gates because they are magically protected against that. It would be easier to walk through hell until they found a hole. The other guard and Bogrol do nothing at all because of all of this. However, this job has its benefits just like any other. The main advantage is being able to easily come to Earth or visit other hells. The other guard and Bogrol are sometimes bored, so they take turns watching over the gates of hell while the other goes wherever they want. Bogrol plays in this bar all day long, as he always does on his last day here. Dio has one chance to get what he wants now. Otherwise, he'll have to wait for another rotation. You can play if you have something valuable to buy the chips. Bogrol said it in a dry and deep voice. And if it isn't the new partner of Wonder Woman, I'm Emily Briggs. The vampire spoke while extending her hand toward Dio. Dio took it and bowed his head while placing his lips on her warm and soft hand. "Pleasure to meet you, Miss Emily. You can call me Kirix," Dio said while releasing her hand. Emily smiled at him and then made a gesture inviting him to sit. "Hey, old man, aren't you going to say anything?" Bogrol asked the man, who didn't move. "You can sit. He's probably sleeping with his eyes open again," Bogrol said. Dio pulls the chair and sits down while looking at the poker table and seeing that the cards haven't been dealt yet. There are several small gold, silver, and bronze chips in front of each player. It seems like Dio arrived at the beginning of the game. "So, kid, how are you going to buy your chips?" Bogrol asked while smiling like a fox. The mortal's money is worthless to beings like them, and since mystical beings don't have their own currency, exchanges are almost always made using artifacts, ingredients, favors, or knowledge. The things here wouldn't be different. Dio put his hand in his pocket and took something out. He could put his spells on the table. A unique and newly created spell is worth a lot. However, Dio was sure the owner of this place made a copy of the knowledge during the game. Dio decides to put a dark stone on the table in order to avoid disclosing any information about his spells to a potential enemy. "Oh, how rare." For the first time, the old man spoke and looked at the small stone. Dio was placing on the table the stone that hangs from his necklace, which was given to him when he was a child. It is not simple to escape the Underworld. Normally, it's very hard to get something from the Underworld. Hades would send his servants after the item, even if it were possible, and they would never stop looking for the thief. Of course, there is a chance that someone will completely escape, but this is extremely rare. This means that even a tiny piece of metal from the Underworld is extremely valuable. A small piece of Underworld metal even makes the dwarves drool. Bogrol said this while laughing. The small piece of metal in front of his table disappeared, and several chips appeared in its place. That's how anyone plays here. They put something down, and it's evaluated. They can play as much as they want with the chips. In the end, if they have one more chips, they can get back what they put in by returning it and keeping the extra chips. Their item will have to wait a few days if they don't win and lose all the chips. It goes into the prizes that can be bought if they can't get it back. Chapter 80. Chapter 79. Just a small piece of the stone, and you won all these chips. I can imagine how much that lovely black sword you carry is worth. Emily teases Dio. We need to play now. We agreed to start with 4 bronze chips. Bogrol shouted. There were 4 bronze chips for each player. They were thrown into the middle of the table, where they were magically stacked. A deck appeared in the center of the table. It shuffled itself quickly, and 2 cards were dealt to each of us. This happened in a split second. When the 4 of them touched their cards, 3 more were placed in the center of the table for all of them to see. I bet 2 more. Borgal shouted while throwing 2 more bronze chips. I cover. Me too. The old man and Emily also threw their chips. I raise. Dio said this while throwing a silver chip into the bronze pile. Everyone looks at Dio as if he were an idiot. They're not wrong. Dio is playing poker against a demon, a being who is infamous for being the one who invented cheating in games. In addition, Dio's knowledge of the game comes from watching it on the internet. This definitely makes him look like an idiot. Fortunately, poker isn't played with a hand, but with a bluff. To know how everyone bluffs, Dio has to make things go out of control in the beginning. Just a small change in the rhythm. After that, he can start playing seriously and patiently. It seems to have worked. I'll pay to see. Emily shouted excitedly when the 4th card appeared next to the others and flipped it up. Looking at his cards in hand, Dio saw that he had a likely combination of numbers but not enough. Bogrol covered Dio's raise and continued the game. It looks like it's going to be easy to clean up your stack, kid. Bogrol said. Would you like a drink, sir? A voice behind Dio sounded, breaking his focus on the game. Dio looked back and saw a woman with red hair wearing a small dress with wings and horns while holding a tray. Thinking about it, the idea isn't bad. While regular drinks don't affect him, drinks made by other species, like dwarves, can make him drunk. These special drinks can only be found easily in places like this. Unfortunately, it wouldn't be a good idea at the moment. Give me a normal wine. Dio told her and handed her a silver chip. For this chip, you probably want a special service later, am I right? She asked while smiling. Should I call the police? Emily asked and looked at the waitress, who seemed not to care. She raised her hand to her empty tray, and a glass of wine appeared on it. Enjoy. She said that and placed the drink next to my arm, then swayed away. It's getting hard to control myself. Children shouldn't start drinking so young. The old man advised Dio while still looking down at the game. Stop giving moral lessons, old man. At his age, you invaded another wizard's tower, stole their personal tome, and set it on fire when he came out. Bogrol said. Homo magi age more slowly than humans, and it seems that the more powerful the wizard becomes, the slower this process gets. So, this old man next to him might very well have been young in the time of Merlin. Making the final bet, Dio raised the glass and took a sip of the wine, and the taste was amazing. Dio already mentioned that common drinks don't get him drunk, so he doesn't see the point in drinking them. In addition, with his sense of taste, they all taste awful to him. But wine is an exception to this rule, so much so that Zatanna sealed the cellar of her house. So the game continued, and it's no surprise that Dio lost the first round by a landslide. The demon's cards were the second highest possible combination in the game. Dio knew he was going to cheat, but at least he hoped he would hide it a bit. The chances of getting a play like that are ridiculously low. The surprise came from the old wizard. He had the second best hand. It seems he is the second toughest opponent. Emily ended up with the 4th best hand. She was here to have fun, not necessarily to win. Not to be impolite, but may I ask a question? Dio inquired. Go ahead, dear. Emily said while looking at him as the new round began. How long has it been since you were turned? Dio asked. There are very few vampires from what he know, and the older they are, the more powerful they become. Emily doesn't seem very old, they don't age physically, but all beings that live a long time give off a certain feeling that Dio does not sense in her, like Diana or the Lord of Order. Dio also recalls hearing her name somewhere. It's been 4 years now. I got a bite as a gift after a fashion show in Gotham. Emily replied after taking another sip from her glass. Of course it was in Gotham. I'm sorry to hear that. Dio said to her. No need. Now I'll be eternally beautiful. Emily said while smiling at him, and her lips were stained with blood that she cleaned with her tongue. I was referring to your career. Dio corrected her. Vampires cannot be photographed or filmed, which undoubtedly ended her modeling career. Ah, you're a sweetheart. It was really tough at first, but a year after getting used to it and accepting myself, I started my own business, Looker, my own modeling agency. Now I remember where I saw her name. Robin once investigated Looker, and he brought it up once at the tower. There were some strange incidents where men ended up injured after attempting to attack some models from a particular agency. After looking into it, he found that a vampire was running the company because the injuries were not normal. Surprisingly, the vampire in question not only didn't harm any models but also protected them seriously. She was involved in all situations to keep the models from getting hurt or attacked. Batgirl and Robin must still be keeping an eye on her, but not directly because she hasn't done anything to prove it. It also means that Emily is not going down the wrong path if the Dark Knight hasn't done anything about it, even though he knows who she is. "Are you hiring?" Dio asked while tossing some chips onto the table. "Sorry, I don't hire male models, even though you would be very, very successful," Emily replied. "It's not for me." "Enough, you two. Are you going to play or not?" Bogrol unhappily shouted. "Later then," Dio said to her, and she nodded. "I promised a job to Corey, and Emily might be a good option." There's no need for Dio to worry about her working with a vampire because her energy blasts, which were named Starfire, are just highly concentrated solar energy, which vampires naturally hate. So the game continued, and Dio even managed to win a few rounds and keep many chips. The stakes increased as the number of rounds grew. Bogrol and the old wizard had the most chips, with Emily and Dio close behind. The purpose of these games was to understand how these two were manipulating the game. Dio knew it involved magic, but the type or form it took was revealed as they went along. The old wizard was the easiest to understand. He simply cast an illusion on the cards while changing them. It wasn't a simple illusion. His skills were impressive, but they were quite useless against Dio's eyes. He used his trick for the first time when two of the spades appeared on the table. The old wizard held up the fourth while Emily displayed the third. Dio had already left the game, but he hadn't revealed that his hand also had an ace, the actual last ace. Emily wasn't trying to win, but she did learn something that gave her the advantage. She could use her super senses to see the signals each of them gave. When she looked at Dio with those red eyes, he felt like she wanted to drain all his blood. That's exactly what she wants, as vampires can't survive without blood, and newly transformed vampires have a hard time controlling their hunger and thirst. It's admirable that she can do it so well at such a young age. Lastly, there's Bogrol. He was also swaying the odds in his favor by influencing the cards on the table rather than the ones in his hand. How he was doing this is still a mystery. He may have some deal with the house's dealer. Dio only noticed that something was off when he felt a slight delay in the dealing when he stayed in the game for just a millisecond. It may not seem like it, but this game is sharpening Dio's senses more and more. It's exhausting, as he was used to shutting out the world to avoid being overwhelmed, but it will certainly be useful in the future. I'll start training my senses from now on. Why don't we speed things up a bit? Dio asked without expecting a response, and he put almost all his chips in the pile. Do you want to go home early? Emily asked while looking at his chips. I just think it's time to end the game. Dio replied. You haven't even seen your cards yet. Bogrol said. He was right. I haven't seen them yet. And does that matter? Dio asked with a smile. In fact, no. Bogrol replied and smiled while covering his bet. It's so good to be young. The old man murmured while also covering his bet. I'm out. The woman in red, next to Dio, threw her cards on the table. Emily only left the game to watch the show. When the fourth card was about to be revealed, Dio made his move. The table took a millisecond to give the card. It's not enough time to raise suspicions, and the card is placed in the center of the table. Then Dio looked at his cards and almost smiled at his luck, unlike Bogrol, who looked at the fourth card on the table, and his left eyebrow raised a bit, a tick he has when his cards are not good. Dio raises the bet. Now he only has 10% of his chips in hand, the rest is on the table, and everyone bets again and covers his move. So let's see. Then the last card was placed on the table, and once again, there was a slight delay, this time created by Dio. How is this possible? Bogrol asked while suddenly standing up from his chair and looking at the card. Dio turned his two cards in hand and showed my combination, the highest hand, and when the old man turned his card for the first time, he also seemed surprised by them, but it was a movement of Dio. Chapter 81. Chapter 80. It looks like I've got the winning hand. Dio laughed happily as the large stack of chips magically came his way. How? The old man asked while looking at Dio. That's when the cards were taken out of the game, but to everyone's surprise, there were two more cards underneath the first five. One of Dio's most potent and challenging spells to use is the Lethe River, which causes the target to automatically forget what it covers. During the game, Dio used it 3 times. Once to trick the magic that dealt the cards and the players, which made the table and everyone looking at it forget that the cards were only dealt once. Then, he added 2 more cards on top of the first ones that made Bogrol's favor stronger, and finally, he used it to trick the old man into forgetting to use his illusions. It was a risky move. Even though it prevented them from cheating, Dio still had to win fairly with his cards, And luckily he did. Bravo! The old man said this while looking at Dio. It was truly unexpected, Emily remarked. Cheater! Bogrol shouted angrily. Seriously, a demon calling me a cheater? Dio asked and looked at him. Ha ha ha. Ha ha ha. Emily and the old man laughed at Bogrol's words. Bogrol stood on his chair, opening his mouth angrily, and then his eyes began to turn red. Dio also stood up while expecting an attack until a woman touched Bogrol's shoulder. Lord Bogrol, the master's rules are quite clear. The woman said this behind him. Unlike the others, she wore a long blue dress the same color as her eyes and hair but had black bat-like demon horns and wings. The woman's voice contained some power, as the red in Bogrol's eyes disappeared almost instantly. After taking a deep breath, Bogrol sat down once again and crossed his arms with a stern expression. The woman in blue gave a glance to all of them, then made a small gesture and left them alone. Let's play one more time. Bogrol said it calmly. Do you have chips for that? I'm thinking of raising the stakes, Dio said while provoking him. Dio took a small fortune from both of them. Dio can now raise the stakes, and Bogrol can either buy more chips or quit the game. Bogrol may have given up something to get the chips, but he will never be able to get it back. Stop fooling around, son of the Underworld. Tell me what you want. Bogrol said this in understanding. The fruit of the Underworld. Dio replied directly. The fruit of the Underworld is exactly that. A fruit produced in the Underworld. There are a few myths about the foods that grow in the Underworld, but the most common one is that anyone, living or dead, who eats or drinks something from the Underworld will be trapped in Hades' realm and can only leave with his permission. Dio has a theory about why this is. The moment something from the Underworld enters their body, it is linked to the realm, thus forcing them to obey its rules. TCH, I should have known. You cursed demigods are occasionally born with some intellect, unlike that idiot Hercules. Bogrol spat. Dio fully agreed with him. He didn't like to break the illusion that Hercules was a great hero, but anyone who has read a bit about his story knows that the guy was a top-class idiot. Of course, he changed in DC, yet Dio doubts that Diana's mother forgot everything he did to her and her siblings. Bogrol raised his hand while bringing his two claws close to the thumb and index finger. When they were about to touch, something appeared between them. It was a small, black, and dry pomegranate, an actual fruit of the Underworld. How's it going? Bogrol asked while playing with the fruit with his claws. It's getting late. How about I just give you everything I've won except for my initial investment? Dio still wanted to get his stone back. And what would be the fun in that? Of course, Bogrol didn't agree. This is getting more and more interesting. Hey, old man, wake up! Emily shouted to the old man, who was now with his head down while lightly snoring. Listening to his breathing, Dio knows he's awake, but his attention is now entirely on the demon in front of him. How do we settle this? Dio asked. How about you owe me a favor and take everything, just like the pomegranate? Bogrol suggested. No, thank you. Dio immediately rejected the proposal. It is not easy to owe someone a favor, and there will be serious consequences if Dio fails to do what was asked. Bogrol then puts the pomegranate on the table and raises his closed fist above it. Are you sure? I can crush it right here in front of you. Crush it. The fruit may be hard to find, but it's not impossible. I'll just have to make a long trip to the ferry market. Dio said to him while keeping a poker face. But Dio was sweating. He didn't know if it was because the magic he did was very exhausting or because of his nervousness. Do you think I, the Keeper of Hell, will allow your entry into the market? A curious fact is that the fairies of this reality made a pact with the Lord of Hell and obtained a large piece of land in Hell, where they created their kingdom after leaving Earth, and this realm is the only one with life and prosperity in Hell. Please. Dio said it mockingly. It was a foolish move on his part. Everyone knows there are several gates to Hell. Seeing that Dio was not hesitating, Bogrol quickly lowered his fist towards the fruit, but he didn't stop him. When his fist was about to crush the dry fruit, he stopped, and Dio won. Damn smart demigods. Bogrol exclaimed angrily while holding the fruit and throwing it to me. Thank you. Dio said this while holding the fruit in the air. Give back my chips. Bogrol shouted in return. Dio moved many of them to him and kept only his first investment. Then he informed his exit from the game while disappearing from in front of him, and a small black stone appeared in its place. Dio grabbed it and put it back in his pocket, where the rest of his necklace was. Well, ladies and gentlemen, Dio said while looking and smiling at her. That was interesting, but I have to go. Dio saw Emily's hand reach out to him as he was about to turn around. Take it, Emily said. It was a card, this time a professional one, not a bum like the one Corey gave him, to talk about the job in question. Emily explained. Hey Venho, are you still sleeping? Emily asked while looking at the old man, who was still sleeping. Good night then. Dio said this to them while ignoring the finger that Bogrol pointed at him. "One moment," Emily called him when he turned around. "It's better to warn your friends, and the big bosses are about to do something big." Emily gave her warning as he turned his gaze back to her. "Great. Why can't I end the night without such a disturbing warning?" Dio nodded, and he walked back to the exit while passing by several demon women and other players who looked at him and knew that he had managed to win against a demon for the first time here. Dio ascended the stairs, this time as a winner, and when he passed by the counter where the Minotaur was serving drinks, he raised his head and asked, "So, it was good for my first time. I promise you that." Dio replied and left the bar. /N. First, I don't know how to play poker, so if any rules go wrong during the vague game, just let it go. Chapter 82. Chapter 81. This is getting really fun. Coriandar shouted happily in front of Dio. Coriandar always enjoys their sparring sessions. This time, they are training in combat while floating. Dio needs to learn Coriandar's fighting style now that he can fly because it was designed for those who can fly. Coriandar and Dio are floating a few inches above the mat on the gym floor on the tower's lowest floor. Raven is sitting on the floor with her legs crossed and her purple cape covering almost her whole body. Normally, she prefers to be alone, but Coriandar always manages to drag the girl closer to her when she sees her. Calder is also here. He was wearing a blue workout outfit and is now lifting more than a ton in bench presses. Coriandar then flew to Dio and grabbed his shoulders with both arms. Dio grabbed the straps of the sports bra she was wearing and spun her around in the air until he let her go, which made her move away from him. "You almost ripped my new outfit." Coriandar said this away from him, with both hands on her chest, while checking if the sports bra was still in place. It was very tempting to be a hero and train with such a beautiful woman, but Dio wasn't as affected by what she was wearing after training with her almost every day. On the other hand, Wally would faint if he saw Coriandar dressed in just a sports bra that covered only her breasts and with gray workout pants sticking to her beautiful orange skin. Now it's Dio's turn to attack. He punched her in the face, which hit the side of his wrist with an open hand. Dio spins his body in the air and kicks her face. Coriandar dodges his hit by lowering a few centimeters and grabbing his leg while throwing him to the ground. "We're not on the ground, Dio. We're flying, so we don't need the ground to push or spin in the air. A habit you'll have to forget when flying." Coriandar repeated it for the third time. Dio stood up from the ground and floated a few inches while facing Coriandar. She may be a ball of energy and excitement, but she is undoubtedly a good trainer. When they are on the ground, they have to kick it to gain momentum forward, but in the air, this is no longer necessary. As a result, Dio was making unnecessary movements that an enemy could use. The problem is that it will take Dio some time to get used to resisting this instinct, even knowing this. Coriandar made her move. She wanted to grab his arm now, but Dio slid to her left and pushed her arm, which made her turn her back to him. Dio took advantage and put his arms around her neck in a chokehold, while his legs were also wrapped around her waist and one of her arms. "Give up?" Dio asked her while moving my head away from her long red hair. "Are you sure you don't want to let me go?" Coriandar asked in a playful tone. She doesn't give Dio time to answer or think, and she flies upwards. When she approached the ceiling, Coriandar turned her body and slammed his back against it. Boom! The shock made Dio let go, and Coriandar turned while grabbing his shirt and threw him to the ground. Blom! Dio dropped a few inches into the ground, and all the air from his lungs escaped his body, but she wasn't done yet. Dio looks up and sees her flying vertically with her arm extended. Dio forced his body, lifted his legs upward, and brought them towards his head, thus raising himself and crouching on the ground. In front of him, Corian's arm was almost buried in the ground. Dio did a backflip while still squatting down, and he hit her in the face with his foot. In the air, she spun a few times until she regained control of her body. She gave him a smile of pure joy and then wiped the blood from her lip, where he hit her with a kick. Then she clenches both fists, and her green energy envelopes them. Dio floated until he was facing her in the air and returned the smile. Then they both moved simultaneously. "Enough, you two!" Ravina shouted. There are two claws made of shiny black energy from her surrounding their bodies to prevent them from colliding in the air. "Raven, why did you stop us? We were getting to the best part." Coriandar looked at Raven and asked. "Look around, you idiots. Your fight is going to destroy this entire floor." Raven replied and stood up while looking at them with unhappiness. "I think we got a little carried away." Dio said this while looking around. The gym is quite sturdy, but they broke the ceiling and the floor, and the shockwave they caused disturbed Calder, who was pulling weight on our side and is now close while staring at them. "Sorry for interrupting you, Calder." Dio apologizes to him after Raven's crow claw releases them, and they both return to the ground. "Don't worry, it was more interesting to watch your training." Calder smiled at them. "So, can we continue?" Coriandar asked Raven, who just shook her head. Why don't we stop for today, Coriandar? Dio suggested. But we were starting to heat up. Coriandar pouted. When I come back, we'll continue, this time outside. Dio said to improve her mood. Which works. I'll take a shower and then have breakfast. I don't want to be late. Coriandar said and flew away. And I need to hurry not to be late either. Calder said this while looking at the digital clock on the wall of the gym. Do you have a date? Dio asked with a smile. A friend of mine is celebrating her birthday today, and I plan to attend. Calder replied without embarrassment. Have a good party then, Dio said, and he nodded and left. Are you going today? Ravina asked him while approaching. It's the best time, Dio replied. It's been a week since Dio got all the materials he needed, but he didn't go straight to the Underworld. Since Dio didn't know how long he could stay there, he had to make preparations and do it on a date when he was free from school. Vanessa is also quite busy preparing for her move to college. Vanessa's excitement to leave her empty house is huge. Dio doesn't blame her. He was also bored, living in an empty house for months. Dio told her he would be away for a few days without talking, but she wasn't upset because she was busy too. Are you sure you don't want help? Raven asked him while facing him with her hood covering almost her entire face, which left only her mouth exposed. The door would take longer to load with both of us going there. I could go in my astral form, Raven suggested. It could be dangerous, Raven, while entering hell in your astral form. Dio once again refuses her help. It's the second time she's offered. He felt bad about refusing her help, but it was not safe for both of them to travel together. Whatever. Raven gave up trying to make him accept her help. How about the two of us train a bit? It's been a few days since they trained. Raven just nodded and sat on the floor with her legs crossed in front of me. Dio approached her and sat down a few centimeters apart while maintaining his posture. They close their eyes, and a few seconds later, Dio's soul floats out of his body, where he sees Raven in her astral form above her body. You've shortened the time, that's good. Raven complimented him. Raven has been teaching him the spells of Azarath for a while now, but his progress is still slow. But I still can't make my soul take shape. Dio said it with disappointment. Yeah, that's also keeping me up at night. I don't understand why you're not progressing. You can still use telekinesis even though you are unable to use the soul self. Raven said it with confusion too. In Dio's spiritual form, he raises his hand, pointing to the weights on the other side of the room. Dio imagines a line extending from his arm and flying to the smaller weight. When he raises his hand, the weight also lifts into the air. Maybe I'm not very compatible with these forms of magic. Dio gave his opinion while lowering the weight. Telekinesis is a trick that every magician can perform, but lifting heavy objects consumes a lot of energy. So it's easier to use a simple levitation spell and then control it. Dio never focused much on learning it, but Raven's telekinesis is much more powerful than the normal one, so it's worth practicing even in his astral form. But this telekinesis should only be possible after being able to manifest the user's soul self. Dio kinda skipped that step. Without being able to summon your soul self, you won't be able to use other Azarath spells connected to your physical body. But maybe. Raven began but stopped talking. What? Dio asked. If you're not very compatible with Azarath spells, why not modify them and create one of your own? You're great at that, Raven suggested. She wasn't wrong. It would also be easier to do that than create a spell from scratch since Dio has the original material to guide him.
https://www.patreon.com/abisuits.
If you want to support me, you can find up to 25 advanced chapters at my Patreon. Backhand index pointing down, drop some stones, backhand index pointing down. Comment. 3 comment. Vote. Chapter 83. Chapter 82. Another task for the list, which just keeps growing. Dio said it with a smile. There's not enough time to come up with many ideas, and the list keeps getting longer, even though Dio doesn't have to sleep. However, Dio can't do anything about it because there are only 24 hours a day, and he is only one person. You're doing very well, and your magic energy reserves are growing very rapidly too. Raven tried to cheer him up. Before Dio reaches his peak, which will probably be in his mid-20s, all his powers will continue to increase naturally. When his abilities were sealed in the beginning, Dio experienced rapid physical growth that became slow. A few days ago, Raven noticed something Dio hadn't even realized. His magic was growing faster than his physical attributes. It also increases as he fills his brain with mystical and valuable knowledge. Of course, the growth in all aspects is not as frightening. It's not like Dio will become as powerful as Superman overnight. This growth becomes more visible over time, but it's still very encouraging and addictive to feel himself becoming more powerful and see his efforts bear fruit. Shall we prepare everything? Raven asked. Since practice isn't going very well right now, it won't hurt to get things started a bit earlier. Sure, Dio said while returning to his body. Dio opened his eyes on the floor and stood up. Raven is already on her feet. I'll take a shower and get my things. We'll meet at the back of the tower in 20 minutes. Dio said this and ran to the shower. Dio enters the shower wearing only a towel around his waist. He can tell someone is taking a shower from the amount of steam and the sound of water. Dio went to one of the showers and turned it on. Dio was about to take off his towel when he heard an unexpected voice beside him. Have you finished your training, Dio? Coriandar asked. Dio looked to the side and saw Coriandar behind the bathroom wall with her long red hair wet. Coriandar, what in the names of the gods are you doing in the men's bathroom? Dio asked and managed to stay calm. The steam in the room is very thick, so he can't see her figure very well, and the wall covers her body up to her neck. That's the only way Dio can keep calm. It's not unusual for things like this to happen. This girl always gets into trouble like this in the tower. She intended to wash her clothes last week but didn't have any clean ones left, so she stood in the laundry room naked. She was with Raven, who kept the laundry room locked all day. Oh, I entered the wrong door. Coriandar apologized without any shame in her voice. Sigh. With a sigh, Dio turns off the shower. I'll be watching from outside. Take your shower in peace, Dio said to her while walking away. Why don't we take a shower together? It's normal among friends at home, Coriandar said behind him. But not here, at least not among friends, Dio shouted while walking faster. But you don't have to wait for me, Coriandar continued. Of course I have to keep watch. If Wally were to enter the bathroom now, the poor guy would have a heart attack from so much excitement. I'm about to come out. I don't want to be late for my first job either, Coriandar said to him when Dio exited the door. Emily's card became useful. After scheduling a meeting with her, Coriandar easily got the job. Now, she's flying to Gotham for her first photo shoot. Unfortunately, when he asked her again, Emily didn't want to tell him anything about the vampires. You're late, Raven said to him, and she was not happy at all. She hates being late. It's not my fault. Coriandar accidentally entered the men's bathroom. Dio informs her. And? Raven asked while raising an eyebrow. We took a shower together, of course. Dio said it shamelessly. What? It's an old tradition from Tamarin. It was so relaxing that I lost track of time. Dio continued. Raven lowered her head, and their mood became a bit colder. How can you take advantage of one of my friends like that? Raven asked with a completely different voice, cold and hoarse from her usual. When she lifted her face, Dio saw her red eyes, and her skin began to change color. Of course that didn't happen, Dio said to her without feeling threatened by her. I was outside guarding the bathroom until she finished. Dio explains, and the redness in Ravina's eyes fades. Why would you believe such a joke? Dio asked. I didn't think she would react like this. I sensed lust in your emotions, Raven replied while lowering her head again. Can you blame me? I'm a teenager, and even considering Coriandar my best friend, she's still a very beautiful woman. Raven has the power to sense the emotions of those near her. Usually, this means that he never managed to prank. This was the first time. To change the subject, Dio looks to the back of the tower, which hasn't changed much since his fight against Roy. The only difference now is a black carpet spread on the floor with some things on it. The materials for the ritual. Let's get started, Dio said. Dio went to the carpet and placed his normal backpack on it. There are several cereal bars, water bottles, and some personal hygiene products inside. Dio doesn't know how long he'll spend in the underworld but hopes it's a week. Normally, Dio doesn't feel hungry. He eats for pleasure and out of habit, but he never tries to find out how many days he can live without food or water. So, Dio was bringing supplies to satisfy his hunger if it happened. Naturally, Diana had told him once that she had gone nearly a year without food or drink while undergoing intense training on her island, and she didn't have a problem. Raven took the lead and walked to the middle of the red carpet. She kneels on her knees in front of the small, deep clay bowl and picks up the first thing that is near her. Dio was confident with spells, but he had never performed a ritual using materials before. So, Dio asked for her help, as it's not a good idea to start practicing rituals with something of this importance. Dio stood right next to Raven while watching her every move. First, she took soil from a cemetery in Greece, which took hours and hours for him to reach by flying. She puts the soil into the circular and deep clay bowl and then takes a small tube with blood. Blood from an underworld being, collected from Diana's sword after a fight against a Greek sea monster. Since all Greek monsters go to the underworld when they die, they are part of it, which makes this blood not too hard to get. The blood didn't change anything, So Raven took a clay jar full of fragrant Greek oil used in ancient Greece for different kinds of rituals involving anointing. The way Dio understood it, it washed the bodies of those who would die. She poured some oil into the container along with the rest of the items. This thing was expensive. Too expensive for someone like him, who only has a monthly allowance from Diana. Luckily, Dio knows a great researcher and archaeologist who has a daughter who hates her and doesn't mind giving him a jar from her personal collection at home. In any case, Dio has to think of a way to make money in the future. One by one, the materials were placed in the disgusting mix in front of Raven. It didn't seem like a ritual but rather a recipe for someone watching from afar. However, there is a specific order, form, and exact portion to put the materials in, and Raven is doing this at an amazing speed with great skill. Raven then extends her open hand to him, and Dio takes 2 silver coins from his pocket and places them in her hand. The drachma is a piece of ancient Greek currency. Julie Capitelis donated another item. Raven placed the threads between her palms and brought her hands to her chest, as if praying on her knees. She begins to recite the Greek ritual softly, and her hands start to glow with a strong black light. A few seconds later, she raises her hands, clasped together, above the clay bowl and opens them. A silvery shining liquid then falls onto the black cake mixture, and the entire contents of the bowl begin to mix on their own. The last item, Raven told him without looking. With a thought, his body is enveloped in a black liquid, and his armor and weapons appear on his body. Dio drew his black sword and cut the palm of his hand while biting his lips to not show pain. With his blood flowing, Dio sheathed his sword on his back and picked up the dried pomegranate from the underworld with his bloody hand. Dio took 2 steps forward and stood behind Ravina, who was waiting for her signal. Now, Raven said. Dio raises his hand and opens it over the bowl. The red pomegranate stained with his blood falls into the center of the swirling mixture, and as it enters, the entire concoction wraps around it like a whirlpool in the bowl. Chapter 84, Chapter 83. Afterward, the mixture calmed down, and now there is a black substance in the bowl that looks like tar. It all went well. Now we just need to forge the key. Raven said this and stood up. This time, it's Dio who kneels in front of the bowl. What item did you choose? Raven asked with curiosity. The whole point of the ritual was to make this substance, which can only be used in certain situations, a permanent key to the underworld. He had already thought of the perfect thing to use. Dio took his sword from behind my back and plunged the blade into the ground in front of him while leaving it standing. Your sword? Are you sure? Raven asked him. It's one of the few things I'm sure I won't lose, and underworld metal is perfect for enchantments. Dio replied while picking up the mixture from the ground. Dio Xiphos, a traditional Greek sword that starts thin at the hilt and widens towards the tip, a double-edged blade. Dio picks up the bowl from the ground and tips it over. A thick black liquid that smells surprisingly like wet earth falls onto the sword's hilt, where a skull with ruby eyes is carved into the silver pommel. The liquid drips slowly while covering the entire sword. It begins to glow subtly, and the faint glow fades away as the viscous liquid disappears, leaving the sword in its perfect state. Success, Dio said while holding it by the hilt and lifting it from the ground. Let me check. Raven requested. Dio turned to her while holding the sword horizontally in the palms of his hands. She comes up behind him and crouches down next to the black blade of underworld metal. Yes, I don't see any issues. Raven confirmed after a few seconds. Well, the time has come. Dio told her with a smile. Are you sure you want to go now? Raven asked while removing her purple hood and looking into his eyes. Time is short. I have to use it wisely. Dio replied while picking up his backpack from the ground and slinging it over his shoulder. He might stay for a few hours if she looked at him and begged him. So Dio walked a few meters on the grass to avoid giving her that chance. Good luck. A voice shouted from above them. Dio looked up and saw Coriandar with all his other friends, including Roy. They were all at the window on the floor above, looking at him. Dio gave them a nod and turned toward the ocean. He looked out at the city and gasped in awe. Dio raised his sword above his head and brought it down as if cutting everything in front of him in half. Άνοιξε, διατάζω. Dio said as the sword made its move. When it falls completely, a thin black crack appears where it passed, and the crack widens a few centimeters while emitting black smoke. The crack then opens completely out of nowhere, and a stone portal appears in front of him, sculpted with various Greek letters. The doors are black with several white skulls attached to them, and in the center of the double doors is one of Hades' symbols, his golden fork, and above the stone portal is a sculpture of Cerberus looking down. The door to the underworld. Dio said it aloud while looking at it with admiration. He wasn't an expert given that he lived with an archaeologist for a few years, but it gave him some sense of beauty to appreciate a work of art like this. The double doors open towards me with a strong creak, and the black mist that was once contained spreads across the floor. The inside of the door has nothing, just a great darkness that even his vision couldn't see. Without fear, Dio took a step forward and then another until he passed through the doors. In the farthest part of the city at this exact moment, there is an old and small one-story house squeezed between two tall buildings. It has its own unique charm despite its small size. There is a stone staircase that leads to the ground floor, where there is a small patio with colorful flowers surrounding it. The flowers are so pretty that anyone walking by would only notice them. On the other hand, they would surprise those who are knowledgeable about magic. They are all very valuable in the magical world, but the sign below, which is connected to the bars of the small patio, makes them give up on anything. Madame Xanadu, enter freely and unafraid. It's written on the sign in blue ink in beautiful calligraphy. On the patio at this moment, two women are sitting, one in front of the other, at a table with a teapot in the center. One of them has straight black hair with bangs, icy blue eyes, and full lips with red lipstick. She's wearing an all-black feminine suit and has a headpiece. It must have already gone by now. Zatanna Zatara said this while taking a sip of her tea. The woman in front of her was leaning back in her chair while shuffling a tarot deck in her hands. A woman dressed in a long red dress had black hair and strong green eyes. She had a black hue around her eyes, giving her a mysterious air. She had a bunch of different kinds of gold necklaces around her neck, and she had a ring on each finger. Aren't you going to say anything? Zatanna asked her. I don't understand the reason for this meeting, Zatanna. The woman spoke in red for the first time, and her voice was sweet and low. Nimue, you know that when he returns from the Underworld, he will undoubtedly gain power, and she may now be able to sense him. Zatanna explained and put her teacup on the table. The woman in red stopped shuffling the cards and then looked at Zatanna. That is inevitable. You know that very well. The spell I put on him protected him for many years, limiting his abilities. Now that he's awake and learning, she will definitely sense him at some point. These words made Zatanna uncomfortable. She already knows the story, but now that she has a strong bond with the boy, she wants to prevent him from suffering. So we have to tell him everything as soon as he returns. Zatanna said. No, my magic is still working, so we have some time even if he strengthens a bit more. Let him live his life in peace. Nimue denied. That's not much time. That boy is immensely talented. He created several spells from scratch. This is something that many magicians have worked on for years. Zatanna insisted while thinking that telling the truth before everything bursts out is the best way. But you didn't tell him that, did you? Nimue asked. I didn't want him to get arrogant. Magicians who become overconfident in their abilities end up doing terrible things. Zatanna agreed, with a slight tremor in her body, while thinking of some friends who ended up badly. The child is the offspring of a god with her, one of the ancients like me. From what I know, he is the first hybrid of this kind, so it makes sense for him to be extraordinary. Talented he is, but to face her, it takes more than talent. He can't do it alone, and leaving him without information can cause us problems. You know how manipulative that witch is. Zatanna tried once again to convince her. Please, Zatanna. I know her weaknesses, but she is still my sister. Sorry. Zatanna apologized, and Nimue smiled and accepted her apology. After that, Nimue places the deck face up on her hand, and a few cards float to the highest part of her chest and face Zatanna. Don't worry, my friend, the cards favor us. It's not time to reveal the truth, but it's approaching. Until then, let's continue waiting. You and your cards, so be it. It's not my secret anyway. Zatanna said as she picked up the cup again and took another sip of tea. Of course, she still hasn't accepted this, and she will surely continue to insist. If she hadn't promised not to tell anyone, she would have already told Dio everything. Chapter 85. Chapter 84. Dio filled his lungs with force with a deep breath of the air around him. The energy he was absorbing made his whole body tingle with joy. Dio always allowed himself to feel things that no human had ever felt before because he was a demigod. The sensation of strength and heightened senses is far beyond what a normal person feels, and being here makes that feeling 2 or 3 times stronger. It's only been a few seconds since Dio crossed the door, but he already loves this place. After going through the same process several times, Dio finally got used to the place enough to open his eyes with his head turned up and see the underworld sky. The cloud is so dark and black that it can't show what's above it, even when it moves. He could see perfectly even though there was no sunlight here because of the illumination. Then Dio looked down at the ground, which was sand and looked like coal powder. Dio bent down and took a handful of it from his hand. He could feel a little magic in the soil grains. The place is so rich in energy that even the ground is bathed in it. Dio took some dirt from a spot where he saw something covered. He easily took the cover off with his hand while revealing a small red stone that looked like a ruby. It seems I won't need to worry about money anymore, Dio said quietly while happily storing the likely ruby in his backpack. So, where do I go now? Dio muttered. Dio didn't appear in any unusual place, And he was certainly not close to the palace, and all he could see was empty land and some hills. Unfortunately, that wasn't enough to scare him because Dio was looking forward to seeing something amazing when he came out of the portal. In addition, he tried to fly, but nothing happened. It looks like Dio will have to walk a lot throughout the underworld to get to the castle. This isn't necessarily a terrible thing because his main reason for coming here was to explore and see what this place has to offer. Not to meet his father, whom he never really knew. The door that his sword can now summon has a certain time limit, which he still needs to figure out. One of its advantages is that he will reappear in the same location on Earth whenever he reopens it in the underworld, no matter where he is. Dio will also appear where he opened the underworld door when he wanted to return. This way, Dio won't always have to take a long path and can go to all the places in this realm. Dio started walking immediately while picking a random direction because he had no idea how to get around this place. This is getting ridiculous. Dio said it angrily but also with happiness while picking up his fourth gem from the ground. Dio knew one of Hades' concepts was wealth. Everything valuable that humans consider to be jewels comes from the ground. That's why the underworld is considered richer than Olympus. On the other hand, the fact that he can literally find jewels on the ground makes him mad because he had to work so hard to get a very small amount of money on Earth. Dio has been walking for almost 6 hours and hasn't encountered anyone. He wasn't tired, but he needed a break, so he sat on a small rock. When he moved his feet on the ground, the gem was found. An emerald, almost the same size as the ruby. Let's keep going, Dio muttered while standing up and continuing to walk. After another 2 hours without seeing anything new, he got tired of maintaining this pace. Dio started running as fast as he could while using his shadow movement to appear where his vision could reach. Finally, the scenery changed when he saw a line of hills in front of him, and each one was about 10 meters high and blocked his view of what was on the other side. Dio started climbing one of them, and finally, he found some sign of life. An unusual gray grass covering the entire hill with some gray trees with no leaves. Dio took a bit of the grass and a dry tree branch near him and put them in his backpack. Dio will take a small amount of everything he finds to see how much it is worth when he gets back home because everything in the underworld is rare. When he reached the top of the hill, he walked more slowly. When he got to the top, the view from the other side took his breath away. There are thousands of souls walking in the same direction and forming lines that lead to a main queue. Dio had never seen so many souls in his life, and they were all unique, wearing clothes from different eras and even different species, but they were all moving slowly but in an organized way. They were following an invisible hand to the edge of the vast area of land below him, a shore that touched the Black Sea, which was actually a river. I'm wrong. I'm still not in the underworld, Dio said while looking astonished below. Dio is actually in the underworld, but not yet, according to legends. The area where he is located is known as Tinarum, which is the entrance to the underworld, where souls suffer from visions and other unpleasant things. Dio really didn't know where the portal would bring him. The spell wasn't very clear about it. Nevertheless, Dio began walking downhill toward the river. When his feet touched the black ground, he felt a sudden difference in the environment compared to where he was before. With thousands of souls around him, he felt cold. Not the ordinary cold of winter. It was as if there was no light in these souls, but there was also no darkness. They were in between. Dio walked calmly among the souls but avoided looking directly at them out of concern that if he accidentally used his power, their memories would overwhelm him. So, Dio continues walking with his head down after entering one of the many thin lines leading to the coast of that land. The line was slow. Very slow. In half an hour, Dio only walked a few meters. Normally, he was very patient, but the feeling this place gives him is getting stronger, and that's not good news. If the memories took over his body, Dio would probably become like one of these souls. Dio left his line and started to walk, even though he knew something bad could happen. He had to avoid the souls of the dead who were all around him, which was hard because there were so many of them. Then the inevitable happens. Dio accidentally touched one of them, and he was flooded with memories of a woman who lived in an ancient Greek called Croton. The woman did not have a good life, and Dio struggled to ignore the memories and move forward. Dio thought he had better control over this power, to see the memories of ghosts, but it's not something he uses often. So, Dio thought having control over when to activate it and choosing what he wanted to see would be enough. But he was wrong. He had never considered that touch would trigger it, but he had also never tried touching one of them. Now there's nothing to be done about it except to keep walking. After 2 hours and accidentally running into more than 20 souls, he was totally exhausted. The memories are not just memories. When he saw them, he also felt what they felt. It's not pleasant. Dio was tired, and this mental weakness is much worse than the physical. Dio was so tired that he could fall to the ground and simply sleep. Unfortunately, he can only keep walking. Since the souls are always moving, he can't use shadow movement. Dio might end up in the middle of a group of them. But Dio could see a small hill in the distance. It had a tree with green leaves and a white trunk. It didn't take Dio long to appear right below it. The hill wasn't being climbed by anyone since no one was near it. With his back against the trunk, Dio sat on the ground and took a deep breath to rest. Dio had imagined that it would be hard, but he never thought he would be bombarded with so much mental torture, and he was only halfway there. While resting, Dio ignored his surroundings. A little above the bunch of souls, he could clearly see that this tree was not the only one. There were many others scattered all over the place, and all the trees were being avoided. Dio stood up, feeling more rested, and with a swing of his sword, he cut one of the branches of the tree and caught it before it fell to the ground. It may seem ridiculous, but he wants to know if the ghosts are avoiding the tree or the hills they are on to not block their path. Dio took a few more breaths and returned, and to his surprise, the souls moved away from him and avoided getting close. Chapter 86, Chapter 85. I don't know what kind of magic tree you are, but I'll definitely plant you when I get home. Dio said this to the magical branch while holding it above his head. The rest of the journey was easy. He finally reached the end of the main line with the branch, where all the other lines met. Dio thought that when he reached the end, he would see the souls reacting somehow, but they all stood in front of a white wooden dock that only had one boat at the end. No longer caring about them, Dio stepped onto the dock and started walking along it while looking at the Styx River by his side. The dock is only about 10 meters long, and at the end of it is a trireme, an ancient Greek vessel over 20 meters long. A big black wooden boat without oars was all that was shown. The ship only had one nearly torn gray cloth sail, and it looked like the whole thing was broken, old and worn. There is a figure behind it carrying a long oar with a very dim lantern hanging from the end. Dio couldn't see anything of the figure. A hooded black cloak covered his whole body, and like the boat, it was all worn out. Sharon, I seek passage across the river. Dio said to him with the most confident voice. The guy gave him the creeps. The Underworld ferryman turned his face toward him while the hood still covered his face, but Dio could see his eyes glowing like fire. Then, he raises a gray, nearly skinless skeletal hand to him with his palm up. Dio opened the pocket of his backpack and placed the magic branch in it, then searched for the passage. Sharon is one of the most well-known figures in mythology, so it makes sense that Dio came prepared in case he encountered him. Here, Dio said to him and threw 2 silver drachmas at him, which magically disappeared in the air and reappeared on his hand. Sharon then puts the coins into his clothes and grips the oar with both hands. Dio took it as a sign to board, so he jumped onto the ship. Fortunately, the old weathered wood doesn't give way under my weight. Seeing that Dio was on board, Sharon moved his oar, and the ship drifted away from the dock. It started to move more slowly with another stroke of the oar. When they were a few meters away from the shore, other oars magically appeared from the boat's sides, and they started rowing. Dio walked carefully across the boat to the center. The center of the triremes is open, which is where the rowers are, so he went to the center and looked at the opening. There he saw many souls of all ages and genders rowing mechanically and without emotion, just like the other people he found here. Since the ferryman wasn't a man of many words, Dio focused his attention on the river. It's awful. The color of almost everything in this place was black. But Dio didn't care about its surroundings. It gave him a lot of energy in a way he had never felt before. The familiarity of his ability to summon its invulnerability was thrown out the window. Dio wasn't summoning true invulnerability. It was something more weakened. That was definitely not its only purpose. Dio kept looking at the water in the river below him while trying to see deep in it. Trum! Dio didn't know for how long it was, but he thought he was in a trance, and he only woke up when the trireme hit the dock at his destination. Dio stops looking at the water and looks at the surroundings. There is a wall on the horizon, but not a simple one. It extends across the entire line of the horizon while separating anything on this side from what's inside. That wall doesn't look like it was built. It is something more natural since it's made of black rock that isn't smooth or even, with no points or patterns. On top of the rock, there are tower-like structures, but there are no people in them or any movement. From this distance, Dio can't judge the size of the Underworld gates, but he guesses that the entire rock where the gates were built is the size of a mountain. Dio jumped out of the boat and stepped on the grass. Dio looked back and saw that the ferryman was already moving away from the small dock. Since he is a man of few words, Dio didn't say goodbye either and continued walking with his backpack with clear directions to the gates. The ground Dio is standing on now is much more fertile than it was before. There are more healthy trees, and some of them have fruits on them. Dio kicked a stone and then realized it was made of gold. He put another gold rock in his backpack. It was funny enough for the Underworld. The only thing that bothers him is the lack of life. Dio knows very well that ghosts are not the only beings in this world, but he believes many of them must be on the other side of the gate. And speaking of it, Dio is finally only a few kilometers away, and now he can get some image of the inside of the gate, but he can't see much. There is a mass in front of it blocking his view, a mountain or something. Speaking of which, Dio is now only a few kilometers away. He can glimpse what's inside the gate, but not much because something is blocking his view. Ha 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 waya. A scream made Dio drop his backpack and cover his ears with his hands. Dio had never heard a scream like that. It was like a howl of a wolf mixed with that of a bat, and they came from above, so that's where he looked. On top of the wall, which he thought was empty a moment ago, there are 3 flying black shadows diving at high speed in the formation of a triangle. Their destination is clear. It's him. So, Dio lowered his super hearing and drew his shield and weapon. That's all he had time to do before they stood in front of him several meters off the ground. Dio looked closely at them now. There were 3 women or things with a woman's body. The 3 of them were all dressed in dirty dresses that covered their bodies, but it was their bodies that caught his attention. They all have long hair, long wings and big, thin claws that look like blades. Their faces were not beautiful. All 3 were thin with wrinkled skin like mummies. Their eyes were yellow, and their lips were red with a few sharp teeth. "Who are you?" Dio asked, and he put his shield in front of his body. There was no talk. They simply dove toward him. They all attacked together. The first had its claws stopped by his shield. Its body twisted to the right as Dio turned, and he was ready to strike with his sword. The second attacked, aiming for Dio's heart. He managed to defend himself with the sword when her claws hit his blade. The third circled around and tried to hit the side of his body. Dio jumped backward to avoid the 3. However, they moved extremely quickly and reached him almost when his feet touched the ground. This time, Dio dropped his guard and advanced. He kicked one in the stomach to send her away. The second tried to bite his shoulder from behind. Dio Dove used the shadow movement to appear behind her, and attacked while aiming for her shoulder. Dio's sword was stopped by the third, who defended her friend by holding his sword with bare hands. They bleed, which is good news. It can also be killed if it bleeds. Dio lost one of them, and her claws hit him on the left side. Dio uses the shadow movement again, this time moving as far away as possible and not making the same mistake as before. Dio looked down to see the damage. At the level of his belly button, 4 stripes from top to bottom of the same width and size pierced his armor and cut his skin. Dio had never tried before to test how resistant his armor was since he didn't have the luxury of being able to repair it if something went wrong. Since Dio also did everything to avoid piercing wounds, it was never tested in battle either. There are 4 claw marks of the same size and width from top to bottom, sliced through his skin, and pierced into his armor at the level of his belly button. Dio had never tried before to test how resistant his armor was since he couldn't repair it if something went wrong. Furthermore, it was never tested in combat because he took every precaution to prevent piercing wounds. However, Dio was pleased with the result. With the size of the claws of the woman who cut him, she could probably tear half of his stomach if he weren't wearing this armor. He will only need to find someone who can fix it in the future. But this is not the time for that. Chapter 87, Chapter 86. For some reason, 3 haven't ended their attack yet. Ha 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 waya. Ha 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 waya. Ha 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 waya. They screamed together, and luckily, he had already lowered his hearing because he probably would have passed out with their voices. Dio is practically deaf now. After using their scream as a weapon, the 3 attacked again, but he was prepared. Επικαλούμε το κρύο της λήψης του ποταμού και ο Κέιτιες. I summon the cold of the river Cocytus's wailing. Dio took a deep breath and then exhaled forcefully. His breath is now a black smoke like tar that surprised the 3. Blam! Blam! The effect was better than he thought. The 2 of them crossed the smoke and hit the ground on their sides. Their wings were frozen. Unfortunately, the happiness didn't last long, as the third also crossed the smoke. The wings were still in good shape, even though most of her body was covered in ice, and she was trying to stick her claws in his eye. Dio lifted the shield, and the claws scratched past it. Then she flaps her wings, moves away, and tries to use the claws on her foot to grab the side of his shield. Dio pulled himself backward with all his strength and pulled her along with him. When Dio saw that he was almost on the ground, he released his shield, and the woman lost control, which spun in the air while moving away from him. Then Dio teleported as far as he could and started running. Dio was at a disadvantage, and he missed the moment to end the battle when the third one was freed from his spell. Since it won't take long for the others to be thawed, this is the best thing to do. Dio put his sword on his back and summoned his shield with a thought. Then he continued to run at his maximum speed, while the third one continued to chase him in the air. Shit! Dio said it with pain. There was no feeling for him during the fight because of the adrenaline. Meanwhile, he was running when his wound started to hurt, and blood was now staining his armor, and he fell to the ground. Dio put his hand on the wound to pressure it, and continued running along the shore of the river Styx on the left. At the moment, Dio can't cross the gates, but from what he remembered from the Underworld myths, there are other zones on the sides of the gate. The problem is that the myths are not very clear, and he might very well be heading to the entrance of Tartarus and be attacked by thousands of mythological monsters. But what can he do? After being chased for several kilometers by 3 Batwomen, he saw a forest in the distance. A perfect place to hide. Dio decides to speed up despite the fact that doing so will cause him to bleed and hurt more. Dio became more aware of his destination as he got closer. It makes sense that there would be fire all around Dio because it is in the underworld. Not fire, but a river of fire that shines intensely. The Phlegethon River, Dio's only healing spell comes from it. Dio teleports to the other side of the fire river instead of jumping because he is still being chased and knows how dangerous it is. It was the right choice. Dio appeared a few centimeters from it, and for the first time since he awakened his powers, he felt an unbearable heat coming from the river. The Phlegethon is a river of lava, but it's not as thick as lava, so it makes more sense to compare it to a river of liquid fire because of the speed at which it moves. There is a terrible smell coming from it, just like the Styx River, and it must be poisonous to any form of life. Ha-ha-ha-waya. 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 They screamed again while approaching. So Dio stood up while holding his wound and ran to the beginning of the forest, which was a few meters away. When Dio entered it, he looked back and saw the 3 bats standing and looking at him without wanting to approach. They should know that chasing him through such a dense forest is suicide. However, there is also the possibility that there is something in this forest that they fear, so they don't want to approach it. Dio had to decide whether to continue or go back. It's not like the choices are very different. Dio started running deeper into the forest while dodging the numerous thicker trunks that stood in his way while they screamed at him. It's not an easy path. The tree roots are very thick and large, which makes the ground uneven. So, he needed a lot of mobility and agility to keep moving at high speed. Dio continued at the same pace for 10 minutes. Then he stopped and leaned against one of the trees, and being so far from the entrance and not seeing anything strange around, he decided it was time to heal. Dio took his hand off his wound. His hand was soaked in blood, and the wound showed no sign of starting to close. Dio raised his hand and said, "Επικαλέστηκα την τιμωρία του ποταμού Phlegethon. I invoke the punishment of the river Phlegethon." Dio felt his energy reserves decrease a lot, and then a red drop of lava from the Phlegethon River appeared floating above his hand. Dio never assumed that he would need to drink this to heal. He knew well the agony it causes, and he even enjoyed watching Dr. Psycho, who tried to control Diana from drinking a drop. Karma. Dio brought his hand toward his mouth. There's no point in delaying this, so he did it quickly. But when the drop was a few inches from his mouth, he saw something moving towards his head from behind him. Dio jumped forward and rolled on the ground until he stood facing the one who attacked him, and he saw an old rusty sword stuck in the trunk where he was leaning. The attacker was a skeleton, held the sword's hilt, and exerted force to pull it out of the trunk. What a waste! Dio said while looking at the drop of the Phlegethon River that fell to the ground when he dodged the attack. It's a waste because summoning a drop requires a significant amount of magic and energy, and now he has to do it again. CRKKKK. Finally, the skeleton manages to pull the sword out of the trunk and leave a piece of it behind. He turned toward him and started walking slowly in his direction. Dio didn't draw his sword or shield. Dio can see that he's not a big problem by looking at him more closely. He attacked. Dio dodged to the left while letting the sword pass by him and gripped his wrist tightly. Crack! Dio broke his wrist, and with his bony hand still holding the sword, he twisted his wrist and hit his neck, which made his skull fall to the ground. Then, Dio hit his ribs with a kick and landed with the trunk on his side to disassemble the entire skeleton. That's the best way to deal with them and disassemble their bodies or break their bones. The first way is much easier. CRKKKK. There is another sound, this time behind Dio. Dio turned around and saw a group of armed skeletons coming at him. In front of them, a zombie in armor and holding an axe was probably in charge. I'm starting to regret this trip. Dio said this while drawing his weapons and preparing for the fight. Chapter 88. Chapter 87. Swoosh, swoosh, swoosh. There are arrows flying around him and hitting tree trunks. He would have a lot of trouble if one of those old arrows hit him. The arrows are worn and dirty, but they can still pierce the trunks. Dio changed direction suddenly in midair as he crouched and jumped toward a trunk, kicking it and giving him a slight advantage over the army pursuing him. Fortunately, the dense forest and lack of pattern created the largest wooden labyrinth, which helped him. Swoosh, swoosh, swoosh. They have lived here for thousands of years, so they know how to navigate this maze. Therefore, Dio can't get rid of them even though he's running at his fastest speed. Do I need to get rid of the leader? Dio thought as he quickly glanced behind him. He looked like a real zombie, with thin, gray skin and little flesh. He wasn't wearing any armor, just a piece of animal leather around his waist, and he held an old, rusty iron sword. He is definitely very different from the skeletons because of his far greater physical prowess and because of his intelligence. It's clear that this zombie has at least a little bit of intelligence because he's pursuing him, even though skeletons have none. Dio could turn around and use a spell to finish him off. Without a leader, the skeletons would become chaotic and give him a chance to escape. Unfortunately, Dio would have to stay away from the wave that is coming up behind him, which will surround him to get away. The chances are not good since he has been running for hours and his wound is still bleeding. Swoosh, swoosh, swoosh. This time, one of the arrows grazed the skull on the shoulder of his armor. Damn archers! Dio shouted in frustration. The archers are relatively useful compared to the other skeletons because they can aim very accurately. They are shooting at him from the trees, which makes things even worse. Tree climbing was another idea that didn't work. That was one of the first things he did. He thought that being up there would make it easy to get away. However, the skeletons can also climb. There's also no hiding from the place. Dio's wound was dripping blood, and he couldn't cover it or heal it without pausing for a short while. A period of time he didn't have. In addition, Dio was saving as much energy as possible, and the day had been long, and he was really reaching his limit. The endless chase through the forest went on for hours. It was only then that Dio realized there was no escaping this, and even though he was injured, it was better to try to go all out. He made some space between them with a burst of speed. A bit farther away from them and with no archers shooting at him yet. He leaned against a trunk while holding his wound. Dio looked at the approaching skeletons. There was a lot of roughness in the area, which didn't help him. The wave moves forward without formation. It will be a mess when Dio attacks from the front. He looked at the area and devised a plan to help him escape. Dio straightened up again and drew his sword. The shield was not very useful in this forest. It would only delay his vision and movement. Dio leaned his body forward and made a sprint with all the speed his tired body could summon. The world slows down around him, but his attack isn't as surprising as it usually is because he has to avoid many things along the way. But Dio reached his target. The zombie was in front of him. The smell of his rotten flesh almost made me lose his attack, but he endured and aimed his sword in a thrust right in the center of his forehead. It was quick, precise, and without hesitation. But the zombie managed to deflect his attack while hitting his blade with his sword and then counterattacking to aim for his shoulder. Dio stopped his strike and attacked again, trying to hit his neck, but he defended again. They stand with their swords crossed while looking at each other. Dio clearly underestimated this zombie. It was about to get a bit more serious when he saw a spear appear at his side. Dio jumped back to dodge, and the spear's blade grazed his armor. The one holding the spear is one of the skeletons currently surrounding him. Ha 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 ha! The zombie shouted while running towards him, holding his sword with both hands and raising it. With Dio's sword to the side, he defended against his high attack by tilting his sword slightly while letting his blade slide down until it stopped at the pommel. Dio punches him in the face with his free hand. Bomb! He may be a good fighter, but Dio is much stronger than him. Dio knocked him out with one punch and sent him flying backwards into a tree trunk, where he fell on his back. Before he could get up, Dio moved to the spear-wielding skeleton, attacking him with a simple thrust. Dio moved to the left and grabbed the spear's handle. He then used his sword to cut the spear in half and hit the skeleton in the chest to break it into pieces. Dio lifted the remaining part of the spear to shoulder height and threw it forward. Dio missed his target, but at least the purpose of the attack was fulfilled. The spear was supposed to hit the zombie's head, but it hit his shoulder and got stuck in the tree behind him, which stuck him. Dio walked toward him to finish the fight, but his soldiers, sensing the danger to their leader, moved faster and formed a wall in front of him. Dio teleported into them and spun his body 360 degrees with his sword extended, cutting them all in half and making them fall to the ground. Dio stood up and quickly moved to stand in front of the zombie, who raised his arm, trying to cut him. Dio cut off his arm, and his weapon fell to the ground. Then he plunged his entire sword to its pommel into his skull. Dio thought the zombie had a brain, which was his weakness, unlike the skeletons. He was correct. Almost instantly after his strike, the blue light in his eyes disappeared. Ha! Dio screamed in pain and surprise while feeling something cut his leg. Dio looked behind him, and a skeleton was raising its old sword again to attack him again. Since Dio's sword was still stuck in the zombie's body, he attacked with his bare hands and fingers extended out. He hit the skeleton in the neck, which sent its skull flying, and then kicked it in the ribs while also sending it flying away. Then Dio looked around. A lot of skeletons carrying old swords and spears were coming toward me and surrounding him. Look on the bright side of the situation. There are no archers in this part of the forest. The Underworld didn't disappoint him. The archers also caught up and shot from above at him. Dio moved his body left and right while easily dodging the arrows. Finally, Dio took his shield off his back and slammed it into the ground with all his strength. Dumb! A wave of divine energy explodes from his shield and spreads around, hitting all of them. It wasn't strong enough to destroy them, but it was enough to slow them down for a few seconds. Then Dio did something stupid, turned his back to them, and went to his sword. Dio put his shield back on his back and held its hilt sideways. Dio pulled it a bit from the zombie's body and the tree, but not entirely. A Zipho's sword is only meant to be used with one hand because the hilt isn't big enough to hold both. Dio didn't care about the pain. He just drew the sword across the tree and cut it. Hiya! Dio screamed in pain again. 2 arrows hit his shoulder and pierced his armor. Dio doesn't care about my injuries because he knows the skeletons are coming to him in seconds. He had to make another cut to get the tree to fall because his sword wasn't as long as the tree. Dio stood behind the tree and gave it another horizontal cut with all his strength, and his sword easily cut through the wood. However, the tree only falls a short distance before being grabbed by those in the area, and the skeletons are close by and have already stood up. Plan C. Dio shouted while trying to think of what Plan C would be. He ran towards the group of skeletons and jumped over them while somersaulting. Επικαλούμε το κρύο της λήψης του ποταμού και ο Κέιτιες. I invoke the cold of the river Cositus's wailing. Dio said as he fell to the ground and started running again. Dio plunged his sword into the center of one of the trees, holding the one he had cut earlier. A black mist surrounded the blade as it became fully buried in the tree. The ice started to spread from the blade, freezing a small part of the trunk. Dio moved to the next tree and did the same thing all over again while dodging arrows. This went on until more than 10 trees around him were all in the same state. Chapter 89. Chapter 88. When Dio was surrounded again, he raised his shield and focused all of his strength on this last move. I hope it works. Dio muttered as he lowered his shield and made it hit the ground. Dumb. This time, the divine energy explosion was much more powerful than before. It knocked down all the skeletons inches away from him, and it shattered the weak parts of the frozen trunks of 3 nearby trees. These 3 trees fell, which caused more to fall until all the trees Dio had touched fell. Bram! The enormous trees that had collapsed around him caused the ground to tremble while striking a serious blow to the army of the undead. The fall created a thick cloud of dust, which Dio used to his advantage to escape. He used what little energy he had left to move through the shadows and avoid the dangerous trunks. It was a success. He managed to escape. He kept moving forward to make sure he was safe this time, even after he was sure he had escaped. Dio decided to climb a tree to the top since there were no souls or zombies attacking him. He then sat down on one of the tree's trunks to do some healing. The wound from the enemy had finally stopped bleeding, but it showed no signs of healing. The cut on his thigh was improving, but the arrow wounds needed him to pull them out without breaking the tips. Fortunately, Diana had given him a long lecture on treating penetrating wounds of all kinds. After removing the arrow, Dio closed his eyes to sense his energy reserves and received good news. The advantage of being here was the high energy concentration. Unfortunately, he couldn't use it freely because he would likely explode his body without proper training. Dio's body acted as a direct channel to the Underworld. Dio could use it to refuel his energy now that he was still taking a rest, even if he didn't need to use outside energy during a battle. After a few minutes, Dio recovered what would take at least an hour on Earth. Έλα, και γίνε τα μάτια μου. Come and become my eyes. Dio won't let himself be taken aback this time. He summons up 4 skulls that float around the tree and let him see from all 4 directions at the same time. Επικαλέστηκα την τιμωρία του ποταμού Φλέγηθον. I summoned the punishment of the river Phlegathon. Dio summoned a drop of a bright red liquid. This time, he didn't hesitate. He brought the drop of liquid fire to his mouth and swallowed it because he was too tired and sick of being in pain for so long. What does it feel like to drink lava? Dio didn't know how to describe it. First he felt something cold going down his throat, then this cold spread throughout his body, and then came the pain. He tore a tiny branch off his side and bit it so he wouldn't have to scream. He tightly hugged the tree to keep himself from writhing and falling to the ground. There is no way to describe the pain of being burned alive from the inside. Dio had never felt anything like it. He had no choice but to try to stay still and not move or scream. It lasted a few seconds, but for him, it felt like hours. Then Dio sat down again and wiped the tears from his face. Then Dio looked at his wounds. They have all been healed, but there is still a scar in the shape of claws on his stomach. He was sure that the scar would eventually disappear now that the wound had healed. Dio looked around to see if anything had happened while he was healing. The skull spell was cancelled because of the pain. Fortunately, Dio wasn't found by anyone, and everything was calm. I feel hungry. Dio isn't really hungry. It's just a feeling of hunger. It's normal to rest and recover by eating after putting in so much energy. So, I lost my backpack while I was fighting, as well as everything I picked up so far and my gems. Dio remembered his backpack only now. Dio decided to rest for a few hours and maybe get some sleep. He cast some simple spells around him. They serve as a nearby alert. The only person who can now approach him without him knowing is a magician. Dio used this same spell to warn him if someone tried to enter his room, but this time in a larger area and about 10 meters around him. It may seem like a short distance to be warned of a potential attack, but with his superhuman speed and reflexes, It's certainly enough unless he was attacked by a speedster or a projectile many times faster than sound. He fell asleep easily this time. Dio woke up a few hours later. It's a bit hard to measure time in a world where the light is constantly the same. Dio should have brought a watch or his phone, but the idea of bringing them for this adventure he was preparing for seemed ridiculous. Dio stood up from the trunk and stretched his whole body while savoring the relaxing sensation it gave him. This was certainly the most relaxing sleep he had ever had. Unfortunately, he always didn't dream. This has either never happened to him since he was a child, or he hasn't remembered his dreams, which seems odd. That's why Dio didn't pay much attention to this fact until he looked it up years ago. According to some research, the complete lack of dreams can be related to mental illnesses such as depression and anxiety. Doi didn't show any signs of these problems, so there must be something else about his lack of dreams. However, Dio let it go when he was out of information. So, what should I do now? I have two options. Continue further into the bunch of trees I'm in or return all the way I came. It's risky for him to go back and fight with the three bats again, as he has to go through the army of skeletons. They may be chaotic due to the lack of their leader, but it's not certain that there's only one zombie in this vast place. The biggest risk of going deeper into the forest is not knowing what he might find. According to the logic of such places, the deeper he goes, the more deadly it becomes. Ella, kikine ta matja mu. Come and become my eyes. Dio needed to try something before deciding. The floating skull slowly starts to go up while going through and around the tree branches and leaves. It keeps going up until Dio has a great view of where he is, at which point he decides what will happen to him. After a few hours of walking at his maximum speed, there is a large circular zone in the center of the forest without trees. Dio can't see in great detail since the shared vision of the skull doesn't have his enhanced vision, but there seems to be some structure alone in the center of the open area. It can be dangerous but also a source of information or opportunity, and since it's somewhat close to him, he decided to take the risk. Dio forgot to consider the forest in his calculations of how long it would take to reach his destination. He first tried jumping from tree trunk to avoid having to move on the ground below, but not all of the nearby trees' big trunks were safe, and he even came across a huge insect that looked like a larva. Dio shook his head to erase the disgusting sight of the insect. So he returned to the ground, and because of that, it took a few more hours to reach the center of the forest. Dio didn't enter the center right away. He observed it from the top of a tree while doing his best to hide himself and watch the situation without being seen. But after a few minutes, Dio was sure there was no one on the long circular lawn covering an area of kilometers in the center of the forest. He was sure there was no one on the grass or hidden in it, but the cave in the center of it may hold surprises. The cave was projecting out of the ground like a gray stone peak. The entrance was just a hole in the wall, so dark that even with night vision, he couldn't see what was inside. He can take a chance on getting closer because the cave is in the middle of everything. He has a lot of space to dodge or avoid getting hit if something goes wrong. So, Dio jumped from the tree and stepped on the ground. When he finally put both feet on the ground, his vision began to shake and blur. Dio made an effort to wake up and try his best to ignore whatever was happening to him. Dio can feel the ground under his feet, but his vision has become the screen of an abstract painting. But it was getting better. The eyes began to focus, and after a few seconds, he could see clearly. But he was still not where he thought he would be. The underworld Dio has seen so far is no exception. Everything has a dark aesthetic, but even the beauty lies in the shadows. Chapter 90, Chapter 89. What used to be green grass on the ground is now ordinary black soil from the underworld. The difference is the enormous amount of flowers and vegetation. There are many bright colors of flowers, such as red, black, and gray. The flowers also smell lovely and admirable. They are arranged in a way that makes a path that leads forward, like walking through a garden. The smoke rising straight from the ground and covering his whole foot in mist gives him a sinister vision. This is just one of the details, of course. The most frightening is the sky, where millions of souls float in circles. Dio had always seen souls, but these souls looked more like ethereal beings. He couldn't tell them apart. Their dancing in the air made a hurricane of souls, with the garden as the center of the storm, and above it is a full red moon that shines so brightly that it fills the garden with natural light. Dio turned to leave as soon as he saw all of these scenes. It was never easy, and a forest was no longer behind him. Instead, a massive wall of black stone surrounded this whole place, whatever it was. Dio had no choice but to move forward. After a few steps, the path gets better, and Dio even reaches a road made of stone bricks surrounded by flowers and big trees with branches that connect from both sides and form a roof over the path. It's not dark. The light of the red moon can still pass through the small spaces between the leaves while giving a more mystical atmosphere to the place. The first living things in this area welcomed Dio when he made the first turn were fireflies. They are flying above the flowers around him. It looks like something out of a children's story, but Dio walks faster to get to the end of the path while always paying attention to his surroundings. The ground gets steeper after going through a stone arch at the end of the road. On top of the hill, he saw a Greek temple. The temple has a simple design with Greek columns supporting the roof. There are no side walls, and everything is made of mixed white and gray stones. The area is well lit because each column has a lit torch. A stone staircase led up to the temple, and Dio began to ascend it. When he reached halfway, he stopped and drew his sword while placing his shield in front of his body. This was because 2 black dogs were coming down the stairs in front of him. In the middle of the stairs, Dio stood still and waited. The dogs didn't attack him directly. Instead, they circled around me and sniffed him. Dio didn't sense any malicious intent from them, but he didn't lower his guard, as everything in this place so far has tried to kill him. After sniffing me for a few seconds, the 2 dogs lose interest in him, run down the stairs, and enter the garden. Maybe my luck is improving. Dio muttered and was surprised that he wasn't attacked. Dio lowered his weapons and continued climbing the stairs, finally reaching the top and standing a few meters away from the temple. There is a woman on the steps and in front of the temple entrance. She seemed to be 2. The woman is much taller, almost reaching 3 meters. She's skinny and has few curves, but her left half is snow white like Dio's hair, and the other half is black, but not dirty or gloomy black, but beautiful and shiny. The length of her hair goes down to her hips, and it has 2 different colors, just like her body. It's a thin but lovely face, and her eyes are totally white. On top of her head, there is a crown of flowers. She wears a simple gray dress with a beautiful neckline. So. First she spoke, and her voice sounded like it had 2 parts. The 2 voices were the same, but they made it sound like 2 people were talking to him simultaneously. You are the crown prince. You are the crown prince. Dio's response to her words was to raise his shield and place his sword above it. The woman was giving him such an immense sense of danger that he started to sweat. The people who are magicians are always more sensitive. The woman in front of him wasn't trying to hide her power. She just stood there in all her glory. Why do you raise your weapons against your sister? She asked. There was neither anger nor surprise in her voice. There is a possibility she wasn't taking his stance seriously because she knew that she was more powerful and that Dio was in her realm. Wait. It took a moment, but Dio finally managed to process the last word she said. You're my sister? Dio asked while lowering his shield. It was a foolish move, which he corrected immediately by raising it again. The Greek gods are all part of a complicated family where siblings marry each other, and so on. So, it makes sense that the idea of family doesn't mean as much to them as it does to humans. She may claim to be his sister, but that doesn't mean she won't steal his soul or turn him into an animal. Yes, I am your sister, Diomedes. She replied. Do you want to kill me? Dio asked. Why would I do that? She asked instead of answering. You just called me the prince, and since you are undoubtedly older, you must believe the crown should be yours. Dio spoke rationally. I'll think later about this heir thing. For now, it's better to focus on the issue now. If I wanted the throne, why would I bestow my blessing upon you? The tone of her voice did not change, and as far as Dio was aware, the gods are not particularly understanding or concerned with deceit, at least not the Greek gods, who would instead settle disputes by force, as opposed to the Norse who take pleasure in cunning. Were you one of the gods who bestowed their blessings upon me when I woke up? Dio asked while he already knew the answer, as he felt something in his body respond when she mentioned the blessing. Yes, just as the Olympians did with their champion, all the gods loyal to our father bestowed their blessings upon you. She replied. It makes sense, but it's not enough to make him lower his guard. I don't mean to be impolite, but what is your name? It wasn't hard for Dio to determine the answer to this question after she said she was Hades' daughter, but it's always good to get confirmation. The place shook when she answered, and this time, her 2 voices mixed, which made him shiver. I am Milanoe, goddess of ghosts. The mild atmosphere disappeared, with a fierce wind gust sweeping across the hill like a gathering storm, as if she needed more proof. Dio looked up and saw that all the ghosts had stopped swirling in the air and began to scatter in all directions while covering the entire sky in pure frenzy. Chapter 91. Chapter 90. Should I bow or something? Dio asked her. It was truly satisfying to see the goddess in front of him turn her head slightly to the side because of his question. Why would you bow? Milanoe asked with her dual and identical voice. The atmosphere then returned to normal, and the ghosts above calmed down while returning to orderly flight and swirling around everything. I guess you could say it's my first meeting God. You may be my half-sister, but right now, you're someone much higher than me. Dio explained a bit calmer. The gods don't have the concept of a half-sibling, so I'm just your sister, and you can act normally with me. I have no pleasure or liking for ridiculous gestures that only serve to infuriate the egos of the arrogant. Milanoe can say that, but it's a bit difficult to do. There's a frightening amount of power emanating from this woman in front of him while asking him to act normal. She's literally radiating energy, And the scariest part is that she's not doing it on purpose to impose her power. It's just a natural part of her. Why haven't you lowered your weapons yet? Don't you accept me as your sister? Milanoe said, and the tone changed a bit. Dio could sense a hint of nervousness in her. Sorry, I don't want to be rude or anything, but I can't accept that my older sister and the goddess of ghosts not only don't want the throne but also willingly gave me her blessing. They were talking about the throne of an entire reality here, a place basically inexhaustible and endless, where there is practically an infinite supply of energy and the authority to do anything within it. I swear by the river Styx that I have no intention of sitting on the throne, and neither I nor those who follow me will harm my brother in any way while he's here. Trum. Once again, Milanoe spoke with just one strong voice, followed by thunder that shook the entire place. After hearing this, Dio finally lowered and stowed my weapons. He was now completely sure that she wouldn't harm him. It seems you've studied our history well, Milanoe said to him. The most sacred vow a god can make is by the river Styx. Whoever takes this oath has to keep it. There are very harsh punishments for breaking the oath. For example, the gods will be rendered for a year and then banished from the divine society for 9 years. This is done to show how important such an oath is, which is why no god has been brave enough to break it so far. A/N. I'll stop repeating Milanoe's lines. It gets confusing to read like that. I left it at the beginning just to make clear how she speaks, so assume that hasn't changed. Come with me, let's go inside. Milanoe said this after turning around and entering the temple slowly. As she entered, Dio started walking towards the entrance and stepped up the stairs slowly. There was no one inside the temple, except for 2 stone thrones surrounding a small fire in the center. On one of them, Milanoe sat and rested her arms on the armrest. Dio kept his pace and sat in front of her. The stone throne is not comfortable at all. Now that we've resolved our issues, answer me something, my brother. Why are you wasting my blessing like this? Excuse me. That was all Dio could say because he didn't understand the sudden change in the conversation. You are the first being that I, the goddess Milanoe, bestowed with a blessing, and you use it in such a ridiculous way. Milanoe continued. I apologize for that, but it's not like your blessing came with an instruction manual. Dio said it with a bit of offense. I don't forgive, that's why I brought you here, to teach you to honor my gift and not play the fool for the other gods. Thank you. You're welcome. There was a certain happiness in her voice, but she didn't understand his confusion. Just for my information, how am I using your blessing wrong? Dio asked curiously. I gave you the ability to do what I do, and you only used it to see their memories. Milanoe became angry again. Dio has always had a little trouble distinguishing between the skills he was born with naturally and those that other gods gave him. Until now, Dio always thought that seeing the memories of ghosts had something to do with his eyes, which can see the truth, but it seems he was way off. In any case, the trouble he went through to get here to receive training from a goddess was well worth it. There's just one thing that could complicate things. It was time. I don't want to seem ungrateful, but how long will this training last? Dio hadn't kept track of how long he was in the Underworld, and he really didn't want the Titans to try to contact him if the limit he set for them was missed. Ah, ah, ah. The sound of her laughter was unexpected. Therefore, when she saw the look on his face, she stopped laughing and went back to being emotionless. That was funny, Diomedes. Can you please tell me the joke? Dio asked. You're probably the only being in the sphere of the gods who is concerned about time. That's the joke. Milanoe replied. There's an important piece of information. Dio knew he was in a reality similar to current DC Comics, but he didn't know which DC multiverse reality he was in. The Sphere of the Gods clarified that. The Sphere of the Gods is a map named after the War of the Old Gods, where gods were expelled from the earthly plane. Imagine that there are 52 spheres, and each one is a different reality or Earth. The speed force wraps around all of these realities. On the outside of the sphere are the dimensions of the gods, the Underworld, Hell, Heaven, Apocalypse, New Genesis, and others. They are positioned at different poles depending on their alignment. For example, Heaven is on the opposite pole of Hell. And how does time pass in the Underworld compared to Earth? Dio asks with concern. There was no information about this in what Dio read about the place, so there's a chance that time passes more slowly here than on Earth. I don't know. I never cared about time. Milanoe replied. Forget that I'm talking about time with an immortal. Let's start, but first. With a movement of Milanoe's hand, the fire between them disappeared, and he found himself several meters away from where he was still sitting, but now with a stone table in front of him and a large amount of food on it. Let's eat. This food was not cultivated in the Underworld but brought here by my ghost servants from the mortal world. Milanoe explained. Ghost servants. A specific type of ghost serves me in mundane tasks. Wine. Milanoe asked. Dio looked to his side, and there was a clay pitcher floating at the height of his head. They lifted the cup next to his empty plate and filled it with wine. "Thank you," Dio said to the servant. This was the first entirely invisible ghost he had faced, but now that he knew that ghosts could do things, this gave him a lot of options. He knows that food won't harm him since the goddess swore an oath in front of him. So, Dio took a sip of the wine and attacked the food in front of him. Dio ate like a king even though he wasn't hungry, but his body always felt like a warrior, like it would be better to save energy for the next battle. After what he had seen and done in the underworld so far, Dio didn't fight his instincts. He ate almost the whole table of food in front of him and drank several jugs of wine. It wasn't very respectful, especially considering he had a goddess eating like a lady in front of him. Fortunately, Milanoe didn't seem bothered by the way he was eating, or she just didn't show it. Her expression was very impassive. After dinner, the table and food were removed, and Milanoe suggested resting a bit more in one of the rooms, and he agreed. One of her ghost servants led Dio to a room. Luckily, the servant was carrying a floating tray, which was the only way to locate him. The room is in the temple. When Dio walked in, he saw that the whole area was empty. But when the servant turned left, he found himself in a dark hallway with several rooms that didn't have doors. Dio was left in one of the rooms and lay down on the stone bed in the center. Dio had already slept a short time ago, and with his difficulty falling asleep, he doubted he would be able to sleep again, but he continued lying down. Dio's sleep in the forest was to rest, but not without worry. His senses were always keeping him alert for a possible attack. Dio was sure that Milanoe wouldn't do anything bad to him after the oath. So, he took the opportunity to rest his body. Chapter 92. Chapter 91. Dio lay there with his eyes closed for a few hours until he got so bored that he had to get up. He left the room and proceeded through the torch-lit white stone corridor. Dio chose to follow the path he used to get here because he didn't know the way to the temple. Like magic, when he turned the corner at the end of the hall, he was outside the temple but not where he came in from the front. He was in the back. The view from the top of the hill in the rear is very different. There is a large area of well-kept green grass with flowers surrounding it instead of the lovely garden taking over the entire area. "Do you like the place?" Milanoe asked from his side. Dio flinched to the left and was startled until he saw that it was Milanoe. "It's a beautiful open field." Dio said this while not knowing what to say about the area. "Thank you. I initially wanted to build a coliseum, but my children convinced me it would be too much." Milanoe said and looked at the view. "Children?" Dio asked. "My children," Milanoe said again while looking up, where there was a bunch of ghosts in its eternal dance. "But enough talk. Let's get started. I'm quite excited to train my first demigod. I've always been envious of the other gods when they bragged about this," Milanoe said while floating over the stairs leading down to the field. In the middle of the empty field, Dio stood in front of her and waited for her to speak. "Firstly, I think it's better to explain my blessing to you." Milanoe began. "Unlike the gods who blessed the champion of Olympus, you didn't receive a blessing that increased or added power to you." Milanoe explained. "That's a good thing." Dio was a bit uneasy thinking that his physical abilities could be reduced if a god withdrew their blessings. So, Dio always hoped that he had gained only some additional powers he could manage with his magic. "May I know why?" Dio liked the way things were set up, but it would be easier for him to give a power boost if he knew why they were that way. "You didn't already have a perfect body like I did, so it would be a waste if it were a blessing to enhance your physique. As for powers, Father was against it," Milanoe said. "So, what are the uses of the blessings I received?" "Our father's faithful gods gave blessings that opened doors for you, but they could not grant powers or abilities." "I don't understand. What do you mean by opening doors?" "I don't know what doors the others opened for you, but I opened the door to my powers over ghosts. Technically, I didn't gain anything immediately. However, with the door open, I have the opportunity to learn." Dio said it with a bit of confusion. "Exactly," Milanoe confirmed. "Does that mean that even if the door is closed in the future, I won't lose all the knowledge I gained?" "No. Let's get started then." Milanoe then raised the palm of her hand, and a brilliant moss-green energy manifested above her. "The door I opened can give you control over what my divinity easily accesses, the manipulation of soul energy," Milanoe said, but his attention was entirely on the luminescent moss-green energy ball. The energy Dio feels now is unlike anything he saw. It's nothing like divine energy or mana. Dio can feel magical energies very well as a magician, but the energy that was floating in her hand didn't seem real. In fact, if Dio were blindfolded, he wouldn't be able to tell if the ball was still in front of him. Mortals have named this energy ectoplasm, a ridiculous name. The green energy changes form into a small ghost that flies around her body like a firefly when she moves her hand. Ectoplasm is certainly one of the most malleable energies. It's incredible how easily it can be molded. Attack, defense, and control are just a few of its uses. The energy changed shape once again into various types of weapons, old and new. Of course, my favorite use of it is to manipulate ghosts directly, as they are composed of this energy. Then Milanoe quickly moved her fingers, and the energy that had been calm in her hand spread to her whole body. The green energy from her extended hand danced in the air, and soon 10 ghosts dropped from the sky and formed a formation in front of him. They looked different now, no longer shapeless. There were men and women in clothes from various eras waiting for Milanoe's command. By manipulating this energy, you can control them as you wish, even making them solid to attack your enemies. The ghosts changed shape again, this time into scarier beings 3 meters tall and with black eyes but no mouths. They looked like they were straight out of a horror movie. Or you can use them to scare your enemies. I loved doing that when I was a young goddess while going around with a bunch of ghosts and frightening mortals. Some of them even died of fear. Milanoe allowed herself to smile at the last sentence. I'll try to ignore her saying that. Snap. With a snap of her fingers, everything disappears, and only the 2 of them are once again in the field. Ready to begin? Milanoe asked. Dio agreed immediately as he was so excited. The training was pretty hard, which made Dio less enthusiastic. In addition, there was a lack of progress after training non-stop for 4 days until it was completely worn out. The strength of demigods is that they don't get tired, which is terrible for physical training but excellent for this type of training, which requires a lot of practice and study. Normally, Dio wouldn't complain about studying magic. It's the only thing he really enjoys studying. He can still say that Milanoe is not a good teacher. She doesn't say much about how she can access this energy because she was born with it and can use it as easily as blinking. So they're going at a very slow pace. The first step to accessing the energy is to feel it. It would be an easy task if the damn ectoplasm itself didn't give any sign of its existence. Dio asked her how she felt the energy so that he could do the same, but her answer was very disappointing. So, a thought came to him after all these days. Milanoe, what happens if I use astral projection in the underworld? Milanoe was sitting on a stone bench on the side of the field. Are you talking about that mortal thing of making your spirit leave your body? Yes. Milanoe turned her face to the left while thinking for a few seconds before answering. Of course, the underworld would try to control you and make you follow the same path as everyone else. It would be like being judged and then going to where you belong. You're safe now that you're in my realm and have my protection. Why do you ask? She responded, which gave him hope. I had an idea of how to speed things up. Ectoplasm is an energy created by the soul and manipulated by spirits, as you said, so being closer to that state might help speed things up. Dio replied to her, then sat on the ground with his legs crossed. She not only gave him hope to speed things up but also the answer to what would happen if he came to the underworld in his projection. Fortunately, neither Dio nor Raven tried it. It took some focus for Dio's soul to slowly leave his body and float above it. The moment this happened, he felt a strange sensation, as if something was calling him, but it was just a distant call that didn't bother him much. This was the first time he felt something in this state, as he never fought with his projection or been hit by spells that could harm him in this state. Let's try again, please, sister. Dio asked while looking at her. Milanoe didn't move, but a ball of bright green ectoplasm appeared in front of him. This is how they were training. She summons the green energy, and Dio tries to feel and manipulate it. Dio sat in the air above his body in the same position and closed his eyes to try once again to feel the energy. Chapter 93, Chapter 92. Whenever Dio trained astral projection with Raven, they never spent more than a few hours outside their bodies. So, this was the first time he stayed out of it for almost a whole day. It was good. In this state, he felt no physical need, so he focused his attention entirely on training. Dio finally felt something after another week about whether he was keeping track of the hours properly. The sensation was undoubtedly new and like feeling something that doesn't exist while something that is there but also isn't. It was cold but also hot, malleable or immalleable, and so on. Milanoe was right. This energy is undoubtedly much easier to manipulate than magic or divine energy, but there is great difficulty in manifesting it unless someone is a ghost or a goddess. Dio was very happy with his achievement, but this happiness disappeared when he returned to his body and realized that the connection with the energy had vanished. It makes sense. Dio can subtly feel the ectoplasm while separated from his body, which slightly increases his sensitivity to it. Unfortunately, this small advantage disappears when he's in his body. You finally did it, Milanoe said while sitting in her place with her 2 black pet dogs lying at her feet. After a month, I think. Dio said while looking at his hand. Dio's hand is now surrounded by a bright gray energy, the ectoplasm. The color is different from hers, but she said that the energy's color changes from person to person because ectoplasm comes from spiritual forces, and everyone has a unique soul. He had to wait a long time to feel this energy in his body, and even longer to summon it up. After a few days, Dio stopped counting, so he thought it had been a month since he arrived in the underworld, but it's almost certain that he was wrong. Now that you have felt and summoned it, all that's left is to shape it to your will. Milanoe is in a state of happiness with her expressionless face. She didn't really help him, but Dio won't say that out loud. Looking at his hand, Dio tried to manipulate the gray energy as he did with the other energies he used, and the response was surprisingly quick. At the speed of thought, a gray energy sword appears in his hand, an exact copy of his Xiphos. Ectoplasm is much more manipulable than Dio imagined. The speed at which it responded to him without showing any resistance was incredible. The divine energy is so powerful that the only thing he can do with it right now is release it in a big explosion. It works well and is easy to use, but Dio didn't think this was a good way to use it as a magician. The ectoplasm is an energy that is difficult to obtain but has limitless applications. One more good thing about it is that when he summoned it, he saw how much it resembled Ravina's energy. She also uses energy from her soul manifesting, which is a more advanced form of astral projection and similar ectoplasm. They are similar but not identical. The good news is that Dio might be able to modify Azaratha's spells so they work with ectoplasm. Well, very good. Milanoe pulled him out of his thoughts as she approached him with her 2 dogs following. You did a good job. The amount of energy you can manifest is not large enough to use it in the way I do. All in good time, Dio said to her, not discouraged. Dio isn't sure if he wants to go in the same direction as Milanoe because what she showed him shows that her style is more long-range, and she attacks with her army. Dio didn't think it would be bad to have an army of ghosts under his command, but he would need to be able to summon a lot of ghosts and practice making them real. For those who are not gods, this is not an easy task. An army is not feasible, but that doesn't mean her teachings are not important. Dio didn't need an army, just a few under his command, for spying, surveillance, or a surprise attack. What's the next step then, teacher? Dio said while smiling at her. Milanoe was so happy that she gave me a small smile. Dio loved the feeling of making progress in magic. It's one of those feelings of self-achievement that gets him addicted to moving forward, but this one requires hard work to achieve. It was easier to make progress once they learned how to handle the new energy. Dio was improving every day. He's not a master yet, but he learned enough to be able to use ectoplasm in a fight. Now that Milanoe and Dio have spent so much time together that Dio has given up trying to keep track, it's time for him to go. It's not that she taught him everything she knows. That wasn't the point. The point was to give him the basics so he could develop them on his own. Being a teacher was as fun as scaring mortals. Milanoe said. They are at the entrance to her personal space, at the portal, surrounded by flowers. Any advice? Dio asked. Milanoe was silent for a few seconds before responding. Try to stay as far away from the edges of the underworld as possible. That's the lawless zone of this realm. The farther from the center you are, the more dangerous things will become. Milanoe began. I was wondering about that too. Why is the underworld so chaotic? Shouldn't it be a realm for souls to be judged equally? In mythology, Hades has always been a figure that mortals feared. This fear was based on the fear of death that they all have. However, Hades was the one who interacted with or caused the least trouble for mortals. That means Hades' realm shouldn't be chaotic, with monsters roaming around out of control. The judgment of souls is equal. Have you seen any of them being attacked by monsters, skeletons, or zombies? She's right. There are many spirits of the dead, and yet they are not attacked. You have to remember that the Olympians love to throw those who offended or punished them into the underworld, just like the monsters that don't follow anyone or are wild. If our father didn't allow a zone where they could roam freely, the underworld would be in eternal war. So, there's an unspoken deal. They are free to do whatever they want as long as they don't disrupt the functioning of the underworld. The only place where there's real order is the center of the underworld. The closer you get to the center, the safer you will be. Milanoe concluded her explanation. Anything else? Dio asked finally. Milanoe then got serious but kept her cold expression as always. It got easier to read her emotions without her showing them after spending some time with her. Yes, Diomedes, you have to be careful with my mother. Milanoe said. With Purse. No. Before Dio could say the full name, she raised a finger, and a layer of bright green energy surrounded his mouth to silence him. She may be a minor goddess up there, but when she's here, she is the queen of the underworld, so don't say her name out loud. Milanoe warned, then lowered her hand to release his mouth. Why should I be careful with her? Dio asked while knowing very well what the problem might be. You are not her child. The answer is not unexpected. Now I have to be careful with the queen of this place. I understand. Thank you once again. I don't know how, but one day I will repay your kindness. Dio thanked her again. It was fun meeting you, little brother, Milanoe said with a smile. Then, behind him, a circular green portal of his size manifests. A portal made by manipulating ectoplasm. Dio will surely learn more about it later. Dio waves goodbye to her one more time and walks toward the portal. It's time to go back, but first, he has to get back his backpack. You can leave now. Milanoe spoke a few seconds after Diomedes crossed the portal and disappeared. There was a ghost in front of Milanoe. This one seemed more real than the others. Its eyes were filled with wisdom, but its body had no shape or appearance. The only thing that stood out were the long horns that stuck out from its forehead. I liked him. He's not as arrogant or foolish as we were when we were young. The ghost spoke and was not intimidated to be facing the goddess of them all. He's so young. It's unfair to put fate and all this mess in his hands. Since when is fate fair? The ghost asked. Milanoe then turned and began to walk towards her temple. At least he won't die in such a stupid way as you did. I'm sure of that. Milanoe said to the ghost, who followed her closely. It's true. The ghost didn't deny it while laughing. Are you going to keep an eye on him? Milanoe asked. Yes, the Furies must have spread the word that Hades' son has arrived in the Underworld. Our mother must already know. I'll keep an eye on him, but I won't help him unless it's to save him from a certain death. She just nodded, and the two continued to walk calmly through the garden. Chapter 94. Chapter 93. Milanoe was kind enough to leave him at the entrance of the forest instead of the center. It saved him a lot of time, even though part of him would really like to test some of his training against the skeletons. On the other hand, those three will be the real test. He doesn't really want to fight, but those three are guarding the gate to the center of the Underworld, so he has no choice but to deal with them. Looking around and seeing that Dio was alone, Dio walked calmly to the edge of the land and faced the river of liquid fire, the Flagonti River. The first time Dio saw it, he was quite busy running away, so he didn't notice its details, the most noticeable of which was its smell of rotten eggs and sulfur. Dio didn't usually feel the heat, so the heat it gave off was also a surprise. He never felt too hot or too cold because the temperature was always mild for him. Dio can still be burned or frozen, depending on the temperature, but it has to be much lower or higher than what a human can endure. Dio kneeled and moved his hands towards the river. Dio was about to make contact when a layer of bright gray ectoplasm enveloped his hands. Dio scooped some water into his hands without getting burned because his hands are shaped like cups and protect him. With a thought, Dio shaped the gray energy into a sphere around the small amount of bright liquid fire. Now that that was done, Dio made his energy stronger. He won't have to focus on it to keep it from disappearing. Dio stood up, and the small gray ball in his hand disappeared. It didn't vanish. It's just been stored. This was a small conjuration trick taught by Milanoe. It converts the physical ectoplasm into energy and disperses it. But when it is summoned again, the ectoplasm returns to the form it was in before it was turned into energy, with the item inside it still intact. It is a very useful trick, and there are various versions of it that magicians use to do the same, to store and conjure their items. However, the difficulty of performing his version of the trick is important. First, the soul produces ectoplasm. So if Dio was not careful and suffered any minor damage to his soul, the consequences would be unpredictable since not even the gods can heal a wounded soul. This often happens because this energy is very submissive and easy to control, which makes magicians and other beings that deal with it less cautious, which is why the outcome is predictable. The good news was that the soul was like a muscle. The more he used and trained with this energy, the more his soul would generate it. So Dio was using up to 80% of his energy to stay safe. Once, Dio went over 95, and he fainted for a few days. Dio's energy reserves aren't very big. For example, this little trick used up 20% of his energy. It is a small price to pay to bring a part of one of the rivers of the Underworld home. This small amount will help him a lot to strengthen his spell and maybe help him create another while focusing this time on fire and not healing. Just one more, Dio said as he distanced himself and ran while jumping to the other river. Dio only found 2 rivers on the journey, so not getting some of the river Styx is a waste of time because he will be farther away from it as his journey continues. The next place Dio walked was towards the Styx River, which was a few kilometers away. From this distance, Dio can already see the natural stone wall where the gates to the central area of the Underworld are located. Dio then reached the shore of the river of polluted black waters. Dio did the same things he did at the river of fire. He scooped up some of its water and stored it for later study. On the way, he saw some white poplar trees, which made him laugh while remembering something. Dio was filled with memories of the ghosts when he got to the Underworld, but he used a branch from the same tree to keep them away because he thought he had found something magical. Dio stored the branch in his backpack, and when he told Milanoe about it, she laughed at him for a long time. It turns out that this is a very common tree without any magical effects. The only thing special about it is that the white poplars are one of the symbols of Hades, and the ghosts somehow know this and stay away from them. Aside from that, it's just a normal tree, which made him feel embarrassed. The path became more fertile, and he finally reached the dock, where he saw his backpack lying on the ground untouched a few meters in front of the dock. Diggo picked it up and wiped it down while checking to make sure nothing had been moved inside. Clearly, the enemies have no desire to steal his stock of food or water. Ha 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 waya. The scream of the enemy made his ears hurt, but he was not as affected as the first time because of the earplugs Milinoe gave him. Dio put his backpack back on the ground and drew his sword while facing the three bat-winged women flying towards him in the sky. The Furies, who are also known as Iranes. They are three sisters born from the drops of Uranus's blood that splattered on the ground when he was killed by Cronus. At the moment of their birth, their only instinct was revenge, so each sister was responsible for punishing certain crimes that mortals commit in the underworld. Dio didn't recognize them before, but Milinoe gave him complete information about them. The reason for their previous attack was also explained. It turns out they are incredibly loyal to Hades, and when the news spread that he would become his successor, they went mad and considered him an enemy of their king who must be destroyed. The three women, wearing only dirty and old pieces of clothing with large bat wings, nails the size of blades, and dry skin similar to mummies, continue to approach at high speed. It is wrong to think of these three as different creatures. They have been fighting together for thousands of years, and it feels like fighting against one another. In addition to their claws, which slow down his natural healing, and the poison in their fangs, which Milinoe told him could kill anyone, they also have this sonic scream that can kill. In other words, it won't be an easy fight. Ha 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 waya. Ha 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 waya. Ha 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 waya. The three scream together once again before attacking him. The scream is close enough to Dio that it makes his ears buzz a little, but it's not a big deal. Then, the three line up behind each other as they dive towards him, all with their claws ready. Dio defended against the first by placing his Xiphos in front of his body and tossing it to his left in time to see the second right behind and the third attacking together. Dio teleported to their left and tried to behead the second, but the third defended her sister with her claws. Dio pulled his sword, took a step back, and kicked one of them in the face, which caused her to collide with the other and roll on the ground. The first one who attacked suddenly appeared in front of him with her claws aimed at his eyes. Dio dove and just barely cut the claw that cut his eyebrow. Dio grabbed her wrist with his free hand, spun her around, and then threw her into the air. Before she could get up, Dio stepped on her chest and raised his sword. Of course, before Dio could finish her, he was once again interrupted by the other two. Επικαλούμε το κρύο της λήψης του ποταμού και ως αίτιες. I summoned the cold of the river Cocytus's wailing. Dio blew a massive amount of pitch-black mist at the two. These two bats flap their wings and rise to avoid his attack since Dio has used this trick on them before. HAA! Dio shouted in pain while looking down. The one who was pinned to the ground by his foot cut his ankle with her claws. Dio kicked her head with fury and pain, which caused her to roll away from him. One of the two flew ones attacked him. Dio ignored her. Instead, he held his sword downward and teleported behind the one floating a few meters above the ground while waiting for her chance to attack him. When he appeared behind her and was unable to fly, he moved quickly while aiming for her wing. She was also fast and managed to dodge, but not before Dio grabbed her wrist, and then she started flying upwards. Dio accidentally dropped his sword from the quick rise, but he still managed to grab her other arm with his free hand. When Dio squeezed her wrists tightly, she spun in the air, trying to make him let go. Dio uses this to his advantage. When she's almost done spinning, he lets go of her, and gravity takes over. He can then wrap his arms around her neck and his feet around her waist. She didn't like that at all, and she did a few somersaults to try to get away from him, but Dio was secure and was squeezing her neck hard. Bong, Chapter 95. Chapter 94. That's when Dio heard a noise behind him and saw some sparks. One of the Iranes attacked him and hit his shield. Luckily, the chaotic flight of the one he was holding was making it hard for the others to hit me again. Dio let go of one of his arms and grabbed one of her wings. He saw that she was getting too close to the river Styx and didn't want to jump in, so she stopped flying, and they started falling freely. So she doesn't cause him trouble again, Dio pulls on the wings, and they tear easily. Hiya! She screams, this time in pain. With his job done, Dio looked around while they fell. He let go and moved to the left. One of them fell without being able to fly, and the other one went to help her sister. The last Iranese flew towards him with her arms outstretched and her mouth open. A mouth that Dio hit with all his strength. She tried to run away, but Dio held her hair and pulled her closer. He did the same thing he did with the first one, lying on her back and holding one of her wings. Dio didn't have time to tear her like he did with the other because the ground came first. Bomb! In the middle of the fall, Dio succeeded in turning Iranese's body downward, but he had to release her when he hit the ground, and his body shook a little before he could straighten up. Dio raised his hand, and his sword returned to him. He wouldn't get hurt badly if he fell from this height. Demigods can handle that kind of damage. Unfortunately, the two Iranes that fell to the ground were also quite resilient and were not seriously injured. At least the one who fell with him had one of her wings broken in the fall, so 2 of them are now stuck on the ground with him. One more. Dio thought as he saw the last one still in the air. She was clever and didn't approach alone. The other 2 are slowly walking toward me. They are not used to fighting on the ground. Dio just waited for them. The 2 on the ground finally attacked him. One of them tried to hit his throat with her claws. Dio twisted his body to the left to avoid it and cut her thigh with his blade. Hi-ya! A deep wound that forces her to fall to her knees. Dio couldn't hit her head because the second one almost struck his heart. He held her wrist to protect himself and twisted it, breaking it. When the Iranese squirmed in pain, Dio stepped on her knee, and when she bent down, he drove his knee into her face. When the last flying Iranese came close to hitting Dio, he turned. However, she was still able to grab him and drag him along the ground for a few meters while she tried to bite his neck. Thankfully, Dio moved quickly and grabbed her by the neck, pulling her away from him. Blam! Dio hit a tree trunk, which made the tree shake. Ha ha! The Iranese continued to try to bite him with all their might. Επικαλούμε το κρύο της λήψης του ποταμού Cocyte. I invoke the cold of the river Cocytus's wailing. Dio took a deep breath and let out the air. The Iranese know what's going to happen and let him go while flapping their wings to try to flee away from him. But that was a bluff. Dio did not cast any spells. When she moved away from me a little, he teleported behind her, cut off one of her wings, and kicked her in the back while throwing her face first into the tree trunk. Before she could turn around, Dio thrust his sword and pierced her shoulder and the trunk. Hey! The earplugs broke when she screamed in pain. Dio put both hands over my ears for a moment to protect himself from her scream. The scream didn't stop, and the pain only increased. In a moment of panic, Dio grabbed her hair and slammed her head so hard against the trunk that her face got stuck in the wood. Then her scream stopped. Dio felt my hands wet. He looked at them and saw a bit of blood, not from the Iranese but from his ears. Dio pulled his sword off of her shoulder and the trunk, but the Iranese didn't fall to the ground. She was still standing there unconscious, with her face against the trunk. Hello, Dio said to test his hearing, but he heard nothing. Dio left the unconscious Iranese behind and looked at the last 2 approaching him. This time, they are a bit fearful while looking at their unconscious sister. Why didn't I kill her? Because it doesn't make me comfortable, and it's also useless. There are Greek monsters that don't stay dead for long. When they are killed, the souls of Greek monsters go to Tartarus, where their bodies are reconstructed. The stronger the monsters, the faster they resurrect, and since Tartarus doesn't care about anything, these monsters easily return to the underworld. So if Dio were to kill the Iranese, she would probably come back to life shortly, considering how time flows differently here. So it was clear that she would seek revenge after she came back to life. It's better to leave them. The last 2 are more cautious, which is not a good thing. Dio prefers his enemies underestimating him and attacking like wild beasts. Luckily, the 2 took too long to act in this way, and now their teamwork has been destroyed. Dio is so sure of this that, for the first time, he is the one who attacks. Dio ran to them and kicked a rock that was in his way. The coconut-sized rock spins in the air like a ball and hits one of them in the chest, exploding into dust that leaves the one hit confused. Dio ignored her and stood in front of the other, who tried to bite him like her sister. Before she could get close, Dio put his sword on its side in front of her mouth, and she bit it. Dio then sticks a finger in her eye, not strong or deep enough to burst her eye, just enough to make her step back and cover her face with her hand. When she took a few steps back, Dio jumped, spun in the air, and kicked her on the side of her skull with all his strength, and the second one fell to the ground. Dio didn't lose sight of the last one, so she couldn't hit him by surprise, but her claws scratched all over the chest of his armor when he took a step back to dodge. The armor was damaged, but Dio wasn't. Dio was worried about the damage to his armor from the last battle when he started this adventure, but that worry disappeared when his armor healed itself while he was training. Milanoe explained to him that the blacksmiths of the underworld enchanted his armor like this. It can use some of its energy to heal itself, as long as it is not completely destroyed. With only one left, Dio took his shield from his back. It would be foolish to fight with it at first because the 3 could take advantage of his blind spot if he raised it. Dio put his shield up in front of him with his sword on the other hand and took small steps towards her, getting closer, and she took a few steps back. Don't be so shy now, Dio said while increasing his speed a bit. Hey! Once again, the damn Iranese screams with all her might. Dio's ears almost explode as he is still not hearing anything, and that makes him completely furious. Dio left caution behind and ran to try to cut her head in a sweeping strike. One of the Iranese ducked her head while trying to stab his stomach. Dio tried to turn to the left, but her claws cut him lightly. He hits her on the back of the neck with the tip of his sword as she is ducking. She fell to her knees while conscious. She falls backward to the ground with her wings still folded as Dio stands next to her and kicks her in the face. Dio took a few deep breaths to recover his energy. It was a short but intense battle. Dio wiped the blood running down his cheek from the cut on his eyebrow. Luckily, the blood didn't flow into his eye, or things could have been much more difficult. After sheathing his sword and shield, Dio grabbed the foot of the Irenes near him and began dragging her on the ground towards the other. While dragging the two on the ground, Dio smells them for the first time, and it's not pleasant. Dio's wounds also started bothering him, especially the one on his leg. Dio has to deal with all the things in the underworld first. After returning to Earth, he will have time to heal. Dio releases the two Irenes in front of the one stuck in the tree. He pulled her off the trunk and placed all three lying next to each other against the tree. Hypnos. Sleep. Before starting, Dio cast a simple spell on the three, who easily fall into a deep sleep as they are unconscious. Dio then took some distance and began his plan to deal with the three. Chapter 96. Chapter 95. Dio had to say that it wasn't easy to come up with a solution for these three. He spent days thinking about it until an idea came to me during his training. Dio didn't have time to test it, and there's a high chance of failure. He will throw all three of them into the river Styx if that happens. This will kill them and increase their resurrection time. Dio raised his hand with one finger extended. At the tip of his index finger, a small grayish glow appears. He crouched down and started drawing large letters from the ancient West African alphabet of the Ghana region on the ground around their bodies. The ectoplasm stains the ground like neon ink, and with each letter added around the three, the ectoplasm becomes brighter. Finally, after a few minutes, Dio managed to write all the letters around the tree. Dio raised his entire hand, which was enveloped in ectoplasm. He picked a random direction and pointed towards it. The gray ectoplasm shoots through the air faster than lightning until he can no longer see it. A few seconds later, the energy travels back to him, and a nearly grayish energy ball with 3 white dots inside it stops in front of him while floating. Dio picked up the ball and threw it on the ground, and it shattered like glass. The 3 white dots transform into 3 spirits in front of him, 2 men and 1 woman. Dio forcibly removed them from their path, but he didn't sever the connection they had with the underworld. That's why they hadn't awakened yet. Well, let's see if it works. Dio said this while standing between the Irenes and the souls. Dio raised his arms, and 2 lines of ectoplasm extending from his hands were divided in the air while touching the heads of all 3. Dio closed his eyes and began chanting a long curse he had learned while studying Zatanna's books. With each word, the circle written on the ground shines brighter until it blocks the view of the 3 Irenes. Dio doesn't usually use curses because they need to be prepared in a certain way, which can't be done during a fight. Of course, there are powerful curses that can be used without such rituals, but they come at a much higher cost. There are spellcasters who usually don't have the courage to use them except as a last resort. For example, there are curses that can be placed on the enemy using their soul. Many use them when they are close to death. The pain is very unpleasant but bearable. It made Dio understand why most witches use animal sacrifices to avoid this. Dio might want to get some hamsters for this purpose, but he will probably end up attached to them and end up raising them. Finally, the lights disappear. Then everything returned to normal, except for his hands, which were dripping blood on the ground. Dio didn't care about that and focused his attention on the Irenes to see if everything went well. If it didn't work, Dio needed to act quickly when they showed signs that it did work. In this way, the 3 Irenes rise at once. They didn't attack him. Instead, they stood there staring at something in the sky. All is well so far. After a few seconds like that, the ghosts behind him started to move, and they did the same while walking in the same rhythm step by step. Success. The curse Dio used comes from voodoo witchcraft. The translation for its complicated name would be the mirror curse. It is a name that explains everything because it links 2 people and forces one of them to do everything the other does, like a mirror. Normally, ghosts cannot be cursed, but ectoplasm has a unique way of making the impossible possible for beings like them. These souls have to walk to the center of the underworld since they are in a kind of trance. The Irenes were also affected by this effect, turning them into the way they are now. They will continue walking like this until the judgment of the 3 judges. That plan wouldn't work very well anywhere else, but Dio is leaving the underworld, where time moves much faster than on Earth, or so he hoped. While Milanoe said that no one cares about time in the underworld, this means that there are real souls from ancient Greece who are still waiting in line. The Irenes will stay this way for a very, very long time if no one comes to help them. Dio sat on a rock and watched the 6 of them slowly walk across the plain toward the gate. Dio enjoyed a bit of peace in the underworld for a few minutes before walking calmly toward the gate. Dio looked on the ground along the way for gems or gold. He was lucky enough to find 2 emeralds that weren't very big. He watched the Irenes even as they walked calmly because he wanted to make sure the curse was working perfectly. Finally, Dio reached the beginning of a road so crowded with lined-up souls that he couldn't see the ground they were walking on. They are all walking in the same direction, toward the huge mountain with a gate carved in its center. The gate is open, and now closer, Dio can clearly see the large black mass he first saw from a distance. An insanely large dog. A dog that is comfortably lying on the ground and even lying down can be compared to the size of a truck. Its fur is as black as night, its body is lean and strong, and its 3 heads are terrifying. The 3 heads resemble the Greek breed Molossus of Epirus, except for their eyes, which are red and shiny. On each head's neck, there is a crude iron collar with a chain just a few inches long hanging. Cerberus, the guardian of the gates of hell. He doesn't seem very active, but with 3 heads, each looking in a different direction, it made him believe otherwise. The original plan for this first adventure was to get here because there are certain safety measures that must be taken to make sure he stays alive after going through the gates. After living in the underworld for some time, it is certain that preparation is very necessary. So, Dio drew his sword. The key to the portal became available for use many days ago. Άνοιξε, διατάζω. Open, I command. With a movement of his arm, a rift in space appeared in front of him, and a portal opened. Dio breathed in the underworld's air again to feel this familiar but unwelcoming place. He knew he would be back soon. Dio did this a few more times until he was satisfied. Then he crossed the portal. The portal left him in the same place where he had entered the first time, at the back of the tower, where there was only grass and open space. It was already night, and the sky of this small planet continued without a star in sight due to the clouds. Dio looked around, and everything seemed normal since the tower was not in flames or destroyed, which is always a good sign, as he is in the DC universe. Dio went to the entrance and then to the elevator. The elevator took him to the floor with the common room, which is where almost everyone stays. Dio looked at the screen above the elevator as it went up. It showed the date and time. 2 weeks. Dio said it aloud. Dio was expecting to spend only 1 week in the underworld, but time there left him confused. Dio was very lucky. It could have been years. Dio has to talk to Vanessa immediately, then catch up on what the Titans are doing. When the door opened, he realized that the place was empty. Dio hurried to the upper level of the floor, where the rooms were, and when he got to the front of his door, he noticed a note that clearly had Raven's writing on it. "We went on a mission without you." Dio tore the note from the door and felt the spell she had placed on it. No one had entered his room. Dio entered it and went directly to his phone on top of his bed. Before finding out where his friends are, Dio has to endure a long scolding from Vanessa. Chapter 97, Chapter 96. Only a note didn't give him much information, but he knew he could get details by going to the tower's computer. Dio needs to heal his wounds first, and then he needs to catch up with them. The only person he talks to in this way is Vanessa. The next thing Dio did was sit down on his bed in his room and start to treat his wounds. The situation wasn't as bad as when he fled through the forest, so he just needed to bandage the wound on his leg that had already stopped bleeding with gauze and let his natural healing work. Then Dio looked around for his cell phone, which was in the usual place. Dio put it on the charger and turned it on, only to see it freeze due to the notifications of messages and calls that have been appearing. The messages were as expected and showed concern and a bit of anger for not being answered. So Dio called her right away. "Where the hell were you?" Vanessa's first word to him. Dio had informed her that he would be away for a while, but he didn't tell her where, and since the time extended for another week, she got worried. "I don't want to lie now, so I'll tell you everything." Dio gave her a shortened version of what happened that left out a lot of details. She liked hearing him talk about his missions, so she stopped talking and listened, but he could still feel her anger on the other end of the phone. "Why did you lie to me and not tell me where you were going? I don't want to leave you worried." Dio responded honestly. "You failed your mission, but forget it. Let's talk about this face-to-face later. Vanessa is coming to college in the city, and she will start in a few weeks. Before that, she has to be in the dorm to arrange her things." "So, what's new?" Dio thought it better to accept this and change the subject. Vanessa may not have access to the League's database, but most important events appear on TV. It seems that the weeks have been very calm. The only event of importance is the abnormal number of disappearances in major cities. The exact number is still being checked, but in the 2 weeks since the last update, more than 100 people have vanished without a trace. The city with the highest number of disappearances is Gotham. "Did someone from Metropolis disappear?" Dio asked. "I didn't see it on the list of cities." "Why?" "Nothing. Metropolis should also have been affected if this event had been supernatural and not planned. However, the absence of reports of disappearances suggests that there may be deeper issues happening." "Any news at home?" Dio asked, even though he didn't expect anything. Vanessa didn't answer right away, which surprised him. "Van, what happened?" Dio asked again, and she finally spoke. "It seems that Julia got a new job at a major company in the capital that gave her full funding for her research, and Julia accepted it. She went back to working regular hours and coming home almost every night, because she probably sleeps at work some days. What's the problem with that? Dio asked while not understanding the issue. It's not the first time her mother has stayed at home, and they both know that this doesn't last long. The company also offered me an internship position, and even a scholarship at the local college if I accepted. And you're thinking whether to accept it or not. Dio understood everything. The good thing about the proposal is that she wouldn't have to leave her hometown. I'm going to work helping my mom, Dio. Vanessa finally said. Vanessa hasn't tried to connect with her self-destructive mother in a very long time, but Julia is still her mother because she's a good girl. She is seriously considering the chance to connect with her in a way that she can understand her through work. Vanessa, you got a full scholarship to a good medical school, not to mention that Idiot also got a spot at a nearby university, so before accepting the new job offer, you have to think about what you really want and if it's worth it. That's the best advice Dio can give her. Thank you, Dio, I know, but you have to stop calling him an idiot. It's already very strange for him to be afraid of my younger brother being older than you. Vanessa said it with a little laugh. Dio might have been a little scared the day he met her boyfriend, and he might have used a small and simple spell to scare him when Vanessa went to the bathroom by herself just to be warned. What's the company that Julia is working for now? Dio asked out of curiosity. Kale Pharmaceuticals. It seems they are interested in some ancient Greek herbs that my mom can locate. Dio didn't hear anything after the company's name. Kale Pharmaceuticals. Veronica Kale is the CEO and also the female version of Superman's Lex Luthor. Dio was sure that they hadn't had any problems yet in this universe, but Diana's job offer to one of her few friends was a clear sign that she was planning something. Does she know about me too? It's also a possibility, as he doubted that the internship idea came at the request of her mother. Dio, is there any problem? Vanessa asked after he stayed silent for a few seconds. Van, I need to tell you something. Your mom's current boss is not very trustworthy and is under investigation by the League, but she's as good at hiding her secrets as Lex Luthor. So far, we haven't found anything. Dio told a half-truth because he couldn't tell the whole truth. The League did look into Veronica Kale, but they didn't go too far because they didn't find anything to continue with. He doubts that made Batman give up, but he doesn't disclose his private information unless he has to. Are you sure? Vanessa asked with a concerned tone. I am sure, as I'm going to call Diana now to try to get your mom to quit this job. Are we in danger? Vanessa knows the dangers of villains very well, as she grew up with Diana. No, Veronica Kale won't take direct action against you. She doesn't want to raise suspicions. Dio reassured her. That is almost certain to be true because Veronica Kale doesn't act until the time is right. Dio was more concerned about Veronica's likely plan. From what he remembered in the comics, she had an unusual interest in conquering Themyscira. There are some details missing from Dio's memories. Van, I have to hang up now. I need to catch up with the team. Okay, I also have to sleep, and tomorrow I'll reject the internship. No, leave it open until the day of your trip here. Why? Just a precaution. Dio didn't want Veronica to have time to try anything before then. After exchanging a few more words, Dio hung up the call. He immediately got up and went to the elevator. The computer floor, or Robin's personal cave, remained the same. A long corridor with a daunting computer and several screens scattered around the room. The computer was on as usual. After entering the user and password, he looked at the mission reports. They did a few things during these weeks while helping here and there and catching some robbers, but the current mission is what interests him. According to the report, Calderay HM was leading an investigation into the second city with the highest number of disappearances. The dynamic duo Batman and Robin are also looking into the first Gotham because it is their territory. Dio thought the territory they had established was kind of silly, but who was he to judge the thoughts and plans of beings who were much more powerful and older? Before talking to them, Dio sent messages to Diana and Steve and informed them about Julia to express his concerns as simply as possible. Then Dio grabbed a communicator from the side of the table and put it in his ear. Dio tuned it to the team signal in the second city and listened for a few seconds to make sure he was not interrupting anything. Here's Kirix, how are you guys? Dio said it cheerfully. The response comes almost immediately. Kirix, is that you? You came back. Starfire exclaimed loudly, so loud that Dio took the communicator out of his ear for a few seconds. Yes, Starfire, I'm back, and I'm doing very well. You have to tell me about your adventure. How was it? Did you fight someone strong? Or are there good foods in the Underworld? What was the weather like? Starfire bombarded him with questions. He can answer the questions in person, Starfire. Calderachum said with a gentle voice. True, it will be more interesting that way. Welcome back, man. Kid Flash greeted him. I was almost unable to resist the temptation to enter your room. Kid Flash confessed right afterward. You can try whenever you want, kid, but I guarantee you'll have a very unpleasant surprise. Dio teased him. Chapter 98. Chapter 97. Dio has only simple defense spells in his room. They aren't even worthy of being considered defense spells. A curse or two might be in order to keep people from coming in. Dio heard Roy's growl on the other end of the line. That's the most he'd get from him as a welcome. Welcome back, my friend. I hope you had a good adventure. It seems like Calder-HM is always like a monk about things. Thank you, Aqualad. Isn't Raven with you guys? Raven doesn't speak much, but she wouldn't miss a greeting. She's using astral projection to watch over something. Aqualad replied. Have you found those responsible for the disappearances? We thought so at first, but we ended up stumbling upon a different case of slave labor trafficking. He explained. Do you need help? I can be there in 2 hours flying. If all goes well, we'll be heading back home in 2 hours. Understood. Aqualad. Good luck, Dio said while removing the communicator before Coriandar loses patience and attacks him with more questions. Dio got up from the chair and headed to the elevator. He went to the floor where the bathrooms were to take a good shower, and he hadn't done so since entering the Underworld. In the Underworld, Dio's body seemed frozen in time, so showers weren't necessary, but he was no longer in the Underworld. After a long and satisfying shower and an even better dinner, Dio sat on the couch with the tower's laptop while looking into the file about the disappearances in all cities. After being in the Underworld for a long time, Dio thought he deserved a few days off and isn't doing anything. However, there are plenty of things to do. Dio was no expert in investigations, but anyone reading the detailed file on the disappearances knows that something is very wrong. First, they all disappeared in different situations, indicating that the abductor doesn't have a unique way of taking them. Second, all disappearances happened at night. Third, age, gender, or race didn't matter to those behind it. Dio implied that everything seems to be happening by chance, with no plan or purpose. This is because people who abduct people to sell them always go after a certain type of person. This feels like the supernatural. Only supernatural beings leave such a strange trail after their deeds. It's hard for normal humans to solve these mysteries because they always try to think in the most logical way while ignoring magic. Batman himself has to seek outside sources for guidance on matters of the supernatural. Dio is sitting on the big and long sofa in the living room. The TV beeps, and the Robin logo, a red bird with its wings spread out, shows up on the screen. Dio took the remote and pressed a button. The picture soon changes to show Robin wearing his mask and sitting in a chair. From the darkness behind him, he must be in the Batcave. How are you, Robin? Dio asked Robin. Kirix, you're back. Robin responded without emotion. Robin has always been a very serious boy, but when he's alone with them, he tends to relax a bit. In addition, he tried very hard to imitate his mentor or father when he was with him. I just got back and was updating myself, Dio said while raising the notebook for him to see, then placing it next to him on the couch. How can I help you? Robin wouldn't call from the Batcave if there wasn't a problem. An hour ago, during the investigation of a location, Batman and Catwoman were captured. So far, I have no news or clues about them. Does this have anything to do with the disappearances? I don't know, but very likely. Batman is not the most communicative person, so he always keeps the details of his investigation until it's over. Normally, I and our team would handle situations like this, but with the magic, I'm asking for help. Robin continued. So you two figured out it might be magic. Correct. Batman sent a message to Zatanna, but she seemed to be unreachable at the moment. Batman disappearing isn't a surprise, but why Catwoman too? Dio didn't have any information about whether she and Batman had any kind of relationship in this universe. They've been playing a cat-and-mouse game since she first showed up, but no one has ever caught her, and her identity is still a secret. The news stories about them on the internet don't say much. Catwoman was at the location trying to steal something. Wrong place, wrong time. I'm coming. I'll be there in 15 minutes. Dio said this and stood up. Do you need me to prepare anything? A map of Gotham and something Batman uses. The more personal, the better. Dio replied while walking to the window on the floor. Magicians and witches are the only ones who can block tracking spells, which makes them very useful. Understood. Meet me at the bat signal. Dio jumped out of the window and flew at high speed toward Gotham. It's not far at his maximum speed. It's been years since Dio has been to Gotham. He only entered the city's outskirts the last time, where Zatanna's house is located. That was a long time ago, and it might sound crazy, but he really missed the city. Robin didn't know this, but saving Catwoman is also in his plans. Dio has a code that says one should always repay kindness with kindness. She did that for him once, and it's time to return the favor. Dio's armor appeared in midair as he had that thought while breaking the sound barrier. Gotham. There were black clouds shooting up from different parts of the city, lit up by lightning, and a slowly flying blimp. There were a lot of people going around the city at night and watching out for their own safety. They were mostly looking for an easy target to steal from or a client to make money from. A beautiful black city with the sound of police car sirens as its soundtrack. The darkness of this city is 10 times greater than in any other. In the sky, Dio is flying while no one can see him because, not even using his camouflage device, there's no need. The Gotham City Police Department is on the lower east side of the city, almost in the center. When Dio came here for the first time, he used the stairs to reach the roof. Today, he simply landed on it. The roof hasn't changed. It's still a big place with only the entrance and the large projector with the bat logo pointing upwards. It wasn't turned on. You arrived right on time. Robin simply appears from the shadow on the left, as if he had always been there. Batman's stealth technology is getting better and better. Dio only managed to see him because he's not Batman, but it won't be long before he can't see Robin either. Robin was still in the same style of suit, with a red outfit with a yellow belt and green pants, a short black cape, and his hair styled upwards with his black mask and white eyes. As promised. Here. Robin tossed a folded sheet of paper to him, which Dio caught in the air and unfolded. A map of Gotham with a toothbrush inside. A toothbrush? Seriously? Dio asked him while lifting the toothbrush. You said the closer the better. I was undecided between this or Batsuit. I don't know if he was joking or not, but knowing him, he definitely wasn't. All right, let's get this done. Dio knelt on the dirty roof and opened the map. He held the toothbrush with both hands and cast the spell. Στο όνομα όλων των θεών, δείξε μου τι ψάχνω. In the name of all the gods, show me what I seek. The brush between his hands ignites while disappearing, and the map also catches fire at a specific point. The fire extinguishes while leaving only a black spot on it. Robin approached him and looked at the spot. There must have been a problem. There is another witch interfering with me. Dio said. The black spot on the map was right above the Gotham River, which should be frozen in the winter, so there are no ships on it. No, it's not, Robin said. Care to share? You've heard of Wonder City? Robin asked. Only legends, a city beneath the city. Well, it exists. There are tunnels throughout the city that lead to it, and one of them passes under the Gotham River. Robin explained. If you're right, it means it's on the move. Where's the nearest entrance to this city? Dio asked. Here. Robin replied and pointed to the north of the city. This is clearly a trap. Can you tell me what lead you were following? There was a strange activity at the location. Batman thought the building was a stop before those who were kidnapped were moved. Robin explained. Has any known villain escaped from the asylum lately? No, but several of them have not been recaptured since the last escape. Dio also likes to have an opinion about an issue and criticize it. How has Batman, one of the richest men in the world with both money and connections, never thought of improving Arkham Asylum? Imagine how many would escape if he asked Zatanna for a little help to enchant the place. What happened to your hands? Robin asked with shock. Chapter 99. Chapter 98. Dio looked at his palms and saw the raw wounds carved into his skin. Dio had forgotten about them. It was the price I paid to perform a spell. Don't worry about it. It will disappear after a few weeks. Dio reassured him. It takes a long time for these kinds of wounds, which require some ritual to heal. A few years ago, he used a curse to scare off the 3 rapists, but the wound only disappeared after a month. That didn't bother Dio because they would never go away if he were a normal person. Shall we? Dio asked while getting up and leaving the map on the floor. Robin doesn't know much about magic, but his words reassured him, and he didn't ask any more questions about it. Can I carry you if you want? Dio asked with a smile. A person of his pride wouldn't like being carried. Robin got mad and went to the edge of the building. He pulled out his hook from his belt and shot it up to the roof. Follow me. Robin said this before jumping off the roof and swinging in the air. Dio can fly and be next to him, but Robin is moving much more slowly than Dio, so he chooses to jump from roof to roof while following him closely. What is Wonder City like? Dio asked as we approached the location. There isn't much information about it or what happened to it except for legends. Many of the records were erased or lost. All I know is that it's the size of a small city. Before asking another question, Dio looked to his left and heard something. Go ahead, Robin. I'll have to deal with something first. Without waiting for a response, Dio jumped into the gap between the 2 buildings. When Dio fell into the middle of the alley between the buildings, he ran at high speed while weaving through the dark alleys. In a distant alley, behind a large metal dumpster, a man was pushing a woman against the wall. No, please stop. The woman screamed as she tried to push the man away. Shut up, bitch. The man shouted in response, then stepped back a bit and slapped her across the face. No! The woman screamed again. He tried to raise his hand once more to hit her, but Dio grabbed his wrist, stopping him. Who the fuck are you, kid? The man asked. Now that Dio has him in his arms, he looks more closely at the skinny man in the blue Gotham police uniform. Apparently, Gotham's police are still rotten on the inside. Dio told him he was not happy. I don't know who you are, but let me go now. The man shouted while trying to pull his arm from his grip, but he couldn't even move his arm. Get out of here, Dio said as calmly as he could to the woman, who sat on the ground with her clothes all messed up and torn. Dio can tell she's a prostitute from her clothes while her makeup is smudged with tears, and her face doesn't look good at all. Thank you, she shouted while getting up and running through the alley with just one leap. Come back here. The man drew his gun with his free hand and aimed it at the woman's back. This prostitute represents a much bigger threat to the cop than Dio. It's much more likely that this prostitute will escape and file a complaint right away, which could cause the police officer trouble. Dio didn't think it would help much because the Gotham police aren't very good at handling their own business, and the word of a prostitute won't help the case. Before the man could try to draw his gun, Dio twisted his wrist, which caused him to wince in pain and drop the weapon. Dio pulled him to the left and left him facing the same spot where the woman was. Do you know what you're doing, kid? Assaulting a law enforcement officer? The man threatened him, but Dio could feel his fear. An idiot like you thinks he's the law. This city is surely doomed. Dio retorted. The man tried to reach for his baton at his waist, but Dio was not in the mood to continue this, so he hit the center of his chest with his open palm. The man lifts off the ground a few inches while slamming his body against the wall and then slowly slides down it. What a mess, Dio remarked. This is not an easy situation. I agree. Robin said this while perched on the roof of the building where the officer was. It would be easier if he were just a rapist, but this man is a police officer and has enough resources to find the prostitute. Dio was sure that she would not tell the police anything. Shouldn't you go ahead? Dio asked. My city. Robin simply replied. Any suggestions? Dio inquired while looking at him. I recorded everything and sent it to a friend in the police. Don't worry, Robin assured him. Thanks, Robin. Dio expressed his gratitude. They didn't run into any more serious problems along the way. They only saw minor crimes that weren't too bad compared to their current problem. Finally, they arrived at the entrance of the city that Robin knew. It was located just below an old abandoned building that now only houses drug users and homeless people, who use it to cover themselves from the cold. The high number of homeless people in Gotham who don't have a place to stay warm is a big problem. As they entered, the people in the place didn't even care about their presence. They went to a room where Robin lifted a dirty old rug and revealed an iron sewer cover. The ground had been dug around the cover to allow others to enter. During the long Halloween, Two-Face and the other villains used to hide in tunnels like these. Robin explained and opened the cover. He didn't go down the stairs but jumped directly and followed. The sewer was like any he had seen before. Dark, dirty, and smelly. But this one was much wider. There was also no stream in the middle where water flowed. The tunnel was dry. The entrance is a few meters away, Robin said, taking a small flashlight from his belt and turning it on. You know I can see in the dark. So what? Robin asked. I could walk in front, Dio suggested. My city, Robin responded again. I grew up here too. Dio didn't have much effect. They turned left and faced a long double iron gate, rusty and closed. The entrance. Robin pointed this out. As they approached it, and when Robin put the flashlight in his mouth to grab the padlock with both hands, Dio heard a slight movement above them. Without much thought, Dio grabbed the back of Robin's clothing around his neck and jumped backward while taking him with him. At the right moment, Dio saw 4 shurikens fall from the ceiling and hit the floor made of clay bricks. Suddenly, 2 men wearing tight red suits that cover their whole bodies except for their eyes come tumbling down from the ceiling. The way they drew 2 katanas from the sheaths on their backs as they fell from the ceiling shows that they had both trained. The League of Shadows, Robin said, with a hint of fear in his voice. Assassins. This time I'm fighting against assassins. And not just any ninja, but the deadliest ones in the world. What are you doing here? Robin asked. Of course they came for Batman. Dio responded to his enemies. We have to move faster. It's more serious than I thought. Dio nodded to him and then moved at super speed to quickly deal with the 2 ninjas. Dio landed a powerful punch to the face of the first, which made him hit his back against the iron gate. The other tried to strike his neck with the katana. Dio took a step back, and it narrowly missed his neck. Robin threw 2 batarangs. One hit the wrist, and the other hit the side of the ninja's head. When Robin's 2 feet hit him in the face, he dropped his weapon and held his head in agony. The problem is that many others are ahead, and maybe even their master. Chapter 100. Chapter 99. After passing through the gate, the tunnel began to widen more and more, and now there was enough space for 10 people to walk side by side. The place was still dirty and crumbling. There were almost always holes in the walls, and it would not take much to bring them down. Then a natural light that Dio couldn't identify where it came from became clearer as they approached the exit. "Watch out," Robin warned him. They were hit with 2 weapons. When Dio lifted his arm, the scythe-shaped weapon with a chain linked to it wrapped around his wrist. There was a red assassin who came running toward Dio when he grabbed the chain and pulled with all his strength. He trained very well, and halfway through, he pulled out his sword and tried to cut him. Dio dove and punched his chest while pushing him upward. He hit the ceiling and then fell to the ground, followed by several bricks and dust that fell on his body. Dio looked to his side and saw Robin fighting another assassin. They approached each other at the same time, and when they were halfway there, they threw shurikens and batarangs at each other that collided in the air. The assassin tried to cut him with his katana, but Robin held it with his palms, twisted it to the side, and stepped on his foot. After pulling the sword from the assassin's hands, Robin held the blade with both hands and struck with the hilt while hitting the ninja's chin. He spat blood on the ground and passed out. "That was more violent than usual," Dio remarked and pointed out Robin's more brutal style. "It's orders from Batman. We can't give the League of Shadows any chance. Otherwise, they will surely rise and stab us in the back," Robin explained while keeping the katana. They continued walking without further interruptions until they reached the exit. The view was truly incredible. When Robin mentioned a city of legends, and when he heard these legends as a child, he never imagined that there really was a city of this size here. A city with 100 buildings side by side. An underground city, despite all being in terrible condition. The Wonder City was once the jewel of Gotham for some time until suddenly, a wave of violence and madness took over the city. It was the bloodiest event in Gotham's history, with thousands dead and injured. In the end, they decided to close everything and build above it. It was simply to hide the history, Dio said. No, they did it because they didn't know what caused the madness and were afraid that it might happen again. The innocent Robin told him. Robin, if that were the case, why the hell wouldn't an event of such importance be in history? And why is there no new research data since a small city going mad is not a small event? Dio opened Robin's eyes, who now looked at the city entrance with a different expression. They approached the entrance gate of the city with the gigantic name written above it. Wonder City. The above was full of pipes, and the ground was solid rock. But the buildings on both sides of the street in front of him were all very fancy and beautiful, much nicer than what would have been normal many years ago. The entire street was well lit by strong green lights and positioned on various posts around the street. An interesting thing caught Dio's attention as they got close to the first post, so he went up to it and put his hand on it to feel it. "What's wrong?" Robin asked curiously. "I can't explain, but there is magic in this light." Dio told him what he felt. He was sure it was magic, even though the magical energy he felt was very weak and mixed with technology. The feeling it gives him is familiar, but he can't remember why. An ancient city far ahead of its time, with energy generated by magic and science, is impressive. "We have company," Robin whispered while looking around. "Yes, they may be more trained in the art of stealth than you, but they don't have the same equipment." Dio also replied in a low tone. For this reason, Dio can clearly hear the heartbeats ahead. They are all in a position on both sides of the street. "How many?" Robin asked as he was well aware of Dio's hearing. 20 or so. It's hard to count with them so close to each other." "What's the plan?" Dio asked in a low voice. Robin furrowed his brows and thought. He stayed like that for a few seconds and then looked at him. "You have to go ahead. Do you want to fight alone against an army of assassins? I'll play cat and mouse with them. Meanwhile, you save Batman. Your chances are better, especially now that they've alerted their leader to our presence." Robin's right, but Dio was not comfortable leaving him to fight all these guys alone. "Do you still have thermal vision?" "Yes, why?" Robin asked curiously. "The weather forecast mentioned fog today." Dio answered with a smile at him, and Robin quickly understood his idea and smiled too. They walked calmly with Robin on the side and gave him a small nod. Dio took in as much air as he could from his lungs, and he exhaled dense and dark smoke from his mouth. Suddenly, the smoke covers the whole ground and starts to spread while hiding them both. It gets even bigger and covers the buildings around them. It's not hard for him to summon smoke, and because this smoke was conjured with his powers, it can hide and be blind like normal smoke without harming the air. "Psychothete. Rise." The second spell followed, and 2 skeletons rose from the ground. The 2 that Dio summoned had gray flames in their eyes instead of the normal ones he always summoned. They were enhanced using a bit of ectoplasm to infuse a bit of soul into them to increase their power. Dio hasn't tested how much this improvement is. Their strength should surpass that of an ordinary human a bit, and their resistance as well. Robin wasted no time, and when everything was shrouded in fog, he ran towards the first building, with the two skeletons following behind. Robin's too fast for the skeleton to help him, but maybe it can be useful to draw the assassin's attention and protect him in case something goes wrong. With Robin doing his job, Dio also ran to do his own. The Wonder City certainly lives up to its name. Dio had no idea that the technology of a few decades ago could make what he was seeing possible. The water and sewage filter systems, all buildings made of a material that wasn't usual at the time, and electricity to light up the whole city. This kind of scene makes him wonder what happened here. It didn't take long to reach the center of the city while flying over the fog that was expanding there. Dio stopped the fog from moving toward the city center a few meters away because he didn't know what was waiting for him there. He then went into the fog and tried his best to hide himself. Dio went to the roof of a building right in front of the place and crouched down to observe the situation. The city center was distinct from the rest of it. Even though time has essentially destroyed it, it is still possible to see what the city once looked like at its height. The entire ground was dug out, and a hole 8 meters deep and 10 meters wide took the spot where the street should have been. In the middle of the hole, there are several thick pipes and wires that plunge below while connecting to the bottom of the hole, where luminescent green bubbling water is present. A Lazarus pit. What kind of insane idiot uses the Lazarus pit as a power source? It all makes sense now. Dio recognized the sensation from the lights instantly because it was identical to what he felt in the Lazarus pit last time but much weaker. Anyway, only a madman would think of doing something like this. Dio refocused his attention on what was in front of the hole in the ground. A destroyed tower made of black stones was 4 meters tall and wide enough to fit hundreds of people inside it. The top part is destroyed, perhaps after the city was buried. In front of the entrance to the tower, there's a wooden stake driven into the ground, and on each side of it 2 people are tied with thick chains. One of them is Batman, wearing his gray suit with a black bat on his chest and a black mask. It's likely that his captors took his belt and cape off of him. On the other side of the stake is a woman Dio can't see very well, except for her tight black leather outfit and short black hair. Their kidnapper is walking around them. A man wearing a long green cape, black pants, a golden belt, and a black shirt open at his chest in the shape of a V. He moves with the grace of a dancer, but Dio can see that he has a sword around his waist. He doesn't look old at all with his goatee and straight-combed white hair giving him the aura of an 18th century man. However, Dio could recognize danger when he saw it without needing his memories from a past life. Ra's al Ghul, the head of the demon, and the leader of the League of Assassins.